If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Daniel Harmon. I'm 38 years old and I work as a forest ranger in Bitterroot National Forest in Montana. It's late October 1963 and we've got an early snowfall that's making the woods look like a winter wonderland already. But there's nothing wonderful about why I'm heading deep into the forest today. Two teenagers have gone missing. Tommy Reed, a 17-year-old Eagle Scout who knows these woods almost as well as I do, and Jessica Winters, a 16-year-old girl who loves taking pictures of animals. They've been gone for 3 days now, and with the weather getting worse, I'm worried, sick about them. I know what it's like to lose someone. My wife Emma died 5 years ago, and I still carry her picture in a locket around my neck. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the forest, I talk to her like she's still here. Before I became a ranger, I was a sniper in the Korean War. I came home with a bad limp from shrapnel in my right leg and nightmares that still wake me up sweating. I thought working in the peaceful forest would help me forget the war. Most days it does. Daniel, you sure you don't want more backup? Frank Calloway asks me as I check my gear at the ranger station. Frank's my boss, a good man who's been ranging these woods for over 30 years. I'll be fine, Frank, I tell him, tucking my father's old hunting knife into my belt. It's a K-bar from World War II, sharp enough to shave with. Besides, I'm not going alone. As if on cue, Dr. Margaret Wilson walks in, carrying her research equipment. She's a wildlife biologist studying wolves in our forest. She's smart, confident, and doesn't seem to mind the cold or the danger. Ready when you are, Ranger Harmon, she says with a smile that doesn't quite reach her eyes. There's something about Margaret that seems familiar, though we only met last week. Sheriff Roy Blackwell leans against the doorframe, looking bored. You're wasting your time, Harmon. Those kids probably just ran off together. Happens all the time. I shake my head. Tommy's an Eagle Scout with college plans. Jessica's the top of her class. They wouldn't just run off. Suit yourself, Roy shrugs. Just don't radio for help when you get stuck in the snow. As Margaret and I head out to my truck, I feel the familiar ache in my leg. I reach for the pain pills in my pocket, but stop myself. I need to stay sharp. The forest is different today. The early snow has transformed it from the golden autumn colors to a stark white landscape. As we drive toward the trailhead where the teenagers were last seen, I can't shake the feeling that something's watching us from between the trees. No, I tell Margaret as we bump along the forest road. There have been stories about people going missing in this part of the forest, always during the first snowfall. You believe in those stories? She asks, raising an eyebrow. I believe these woods are older and stranger than most people understand, I answer, watching as a group of birds flies overhead in a perfect triangle formation. That's not normal at all. Little did I know that what we would find in those ancient woods would change us forever, that some things once seen can never be unseen, and that sometimes the forest doesn't want to let you go. The morning air bites at my face as Margaret and I hike deeper into the forest. The snow crunches under our boots, and our breath comes out in white puffs. My bad leg is already starting to ache, but I push the pain away. Those kids need me. The teenagers were last seen heading toward Eagle Ridge, I tell Margaret, pointing to a rocky outcrop in the distance. They told their parents they wanted to take pictures of the sunset from up there. It's a long hike, Margaret says, adjusting her backpack, especially with the early snow. I nod, scanning the white landscape. The trees stand like silent watchers, their branches heavy with snow. Something feels off about the forest today. It's too quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Usually there's more wildlife, I say, more to myself than to Margaret. Maybe They're hiding from the cold, she suggests, but I can tell she feels it too, the strange emptiness of the woods. We follow the main trail for about 2 hours before I spot something, footprints leading off the path. They're partly covered by fresh snow, but I can still make them out. Look here, I call to Margaret. 2 sets of prints. One larger, probably Tommy's, and smaller ones that could be Jessica's. Margaret kneels beside me, studying the tracks. They're at least 2 days old, based on the snow coverage. I stand up wincing as my leg protests. They went off trail here. That's not like Tommy. He knows better. We follow the footprints, moving slower now as we push through the underbrush. The trees grow thicker here, blocking out much of the daylight. The shadows seem to stretch longer than they should. Daniel, Margaret's voice is quiet. Do you hear that? I stop, listening. At first there's nothing but silence. Then I hear it. A faint whisper, like someone calling from far away. It seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Probably just the wind, I say, but I don't believe it. The air is still. There is no wind today. Margaret looks at me, her face pale. It sounded like someone saying, "Help." I pull out my compass, frowning when I see the needle spinning wildly. That's strange. Compass is acting up. The radio too, Margaret says, showing me her handheld radio. It's giving off nothing but static. My unease grows as we push forward. The footprints lead us to a small clearing, and what we find makes my heart sink. A campsite, abandoned and half buried in snow. A small tent is collapsed on one side, and scattered around are personal items. A camera, a backpack, cooking supplies. This is Tommy's tent, I say, recognizing the red and black pattern. And that's Jessica's camera. I pick up the camera, brushing off the snow. The lens is cracked, and when I try to turn it on, nothing happens. They wouldn't leave their things behind, Margaret says, looking through the backpack. Especially not the camera. Jessica's parents said she loved that thing. I search the tent, finding sleeping bags and more supplies, but no sign of the teenagers. Outside the tent, I notice something that makes my blood run cold, a trail of footprints leading away from the camp. But these aren't normal footprints. They're too big, too deep, and the shape is all wrong. Not like any boot or animal track I've ever seen. "Margaret," I call, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "Come look at this." She joins me, her eyes widening as she sees the tracks. What made those? I don't know, I admit, but they lead that way. I point toward a dense part of the forest where the trees grow so close together they form a wall of darkness. As we stare at the strange tracks, that whisper comes again, clearer this time. A voice, soft and desperate. "Help us." Margaret grabs my arm, her fingers digging in. "You heard that, right?" I nod, my mouth dry. We need to follow those tracks. The sun is already starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. We should make camp, wait until morning. That would be the smart thing to do. But something tells me Tommy and Jessica don't have that kind of time. "Let's go," I say, checking my pistol and flashlight. "Stay close." As we follow the strange tracks into the darkening forest, I can't shake the feeling that we're being watched, and that whatever is watching us isn't human. The whispers grow louder as the daylight fades, and with each step, the forest seems to close in around us, like it's trying to swallow us whole. The strange tracks lead us deeper into the forest. The sun is almost set now, and the shadows between the trees grow longer and darker. I click on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom like a knife. "Stay close," I tell Margaret. It's easy to get lost in these woods after dark. The whispers come again, clearer now. "Help us. Please help." My skin prickles. The voices sound young, like teenagers, like Tommy and Jessica. "Hello?" I call out. "Tommy, Jessica, can you hear me?" No answer except the wind in the trees. But I swear the wind wasn't blowing a minute ago. My flashlight beam catches something ahead, a splash of red against the white snow. I hurry forward, my bad leg protesting with each step. It's a scarf. Jessica's red scarf, according to the missing person report. She was here, Margaret says, picking up the scarf. It's torn at one end, like it was ripped off. There are dark spots on it that look like dried blood. A twig snaps somewhere behind us. I spin around, my hand going. Oh, to my pistol, what was that? Margaret whispers. Probably just a deer, I say, but I don't believe it. The forest is too quiet for animals to be moving around. We continue following the strange tracks. They lead us to a small stream, frozen over with ice. The tracks stop at the edge of the stream. That's odd, I mutter, scanning the area with my flashlight. It's like whatever made these just disappeared. As I sweep the light across the stream, I catch a glimpse of something under the ice. I kneel down, wiping away the snow to see better. Oh, God, Margaret gasps. There, frozen under the ice, is a watch. Tommy's watch, according to his parents. But that's not what makes my blood run cold. Next to the watch is a handprint pressed against the underside of the ice, like someone was trapped underneath, trying to break through. I stand up quickly, my heart pounding. We need to... My words are cut off by a sound that makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. A low, rumbling growl that seems to come from everywhere at once. What was that? Margaret's voice shakes. Before I can answer, my flashlight flickers and goes out. I tap it against my palm, but it stays dead. My radio's not working either, Margaret says, her voice tight with fear. In the sudden darkness, I can barely make out her shape next to me. The moon is hidden behind clouds, and the forest around us is pitch black. Then I see it, a pair of eyes glowing in the darkness between the trees. They're about 7 feet off the ground, much too high for any normal animal. And they're watching us. I reach for my gun, but my fingers are numb with cold and fear. The eyes blink once, then vanish. Did you see that? I whisper. Yes. Margaret's voice is barely audible. What was it? I don't know. But we need to move. Now. We stumble through the darkness, trying to retrace our steps. But nothing looks familiar anymore. The trees seem to have shifted, closing in around us. My compass spins uselessly, and without the stars or moon, I can't tell which direction we're heading. Daniel, Margaret grabs my arm, stopping me. Look, through the trees ahead, there's a faint glow, like a light in a window. A cabin, I say, hope rising in my chest. Maybe someone who can help us. We move toward the light, pushing through branches that seem to grab at our clothes. The light grows brighter, and I can make out the shape of a small cabin nestled among the trees. But something's not right. The cabin looks old, too old. The wood is weathered gray, and parts of the roof have caved in. It looks like it's been abandoned for decades. Yet there's definitely a light glowing in the window. As we get closer, I notice something else strange. There are no tracks in the snow around the cabin, no footprints, no sign that anyone has been here in a long time. Hello? I call out, my voice sounding small in the vast darkness. Is anyone there? The only answer is the creak of the cabin's door as it slowly swings open. Margaret's grip on my arm tightens. I don't like this, Daniel. Neither do I, but we don't have many options. It's getting colder by the minute and we need shelter. Stay behind me, I say, drawing my pistol. We approach the open door slowly. The light inside flickers like a candle. As we step onto the porch, the wooden boards groan under our weight. I peer through the doorway. The cabin is a single room with a small fireplace, a table and a bed. A kerosene lamp burns on the table, casting dancing shadows on the walls. But there's no one inside. Hello, I call again. The whispers return, so faint I can barely hear them. Help us, in the dark. Help us. I step inside, gun raised. Margaret follows close behind me. The door slams shut behind us. Margaret jumps, a small cry escaping her lips. I spin around, but there's no one there. Just the door, now firmly closed. It was just the wind, I say, but we both know there was no wind. The cabin is cold despite the lamp and fireplace. Our breath comes out in white clouds. I try the door, but it won't budge, like something's holding it shut from the outside. "We're trapped," Margaret says, her voice rising with panic. I turn to face the room again, and that's when I see it. Words scratched into the wall above the fireplace. They come with the first snow, and below that, in what looks like dried blood, "Don't." Look at their face. I stare at the bloody words on the wall, my heart pounding so hard I can feel it in my throat. "What does that mean?" Margaret whispers, her voice shaking. "They come with the first snow. Who are they?" Before I can answer, the lamp on the table flickers and goes out. We're plunged into total darkness. "Daniel." Margaret's voice is small and frightened. "I'm here," I say, reaching out until I find her hand. Her fingers are ice cold. "Just stay." "Close!" I fumble in my pocket for matches, striking one against the box. The tiny flame casts long shadows on the walls. I use it to light the lamp again, but the flame is weaker now, barely pushing back the darkness. In the dim light, I notice something we missed before. A trap door in the floor, partly hidden under an old rug. "Look," I point. "There might be supplies down there, or another way out." Margaret shakes her head. "I don't think we should open that." She's probably right, but we're trapped in this cabin with no other options. I kneel down and pull back the rug. The trapdoor has a rusty iron ring. When I pull on it, the door creaks open, revealing a set of wooden stairs leading down into blackness. The whispers come again, louder this time, rising from the darkness below. "Help us, down here, please." That's Tommy's voice, I say, leaning closer to the opening. "I'm sure of it." I hold the lamp over the opening, but its light doesn't reach the bottom of the stairs. "Tommy? Jessica?" I call down. "Are you down there?" The only answer is more whispers, too faint to make out the words. "I'm going down." I decide, checking my gun. "You stay here." Margaret grabs my arm. "No." We stick together. I nod, grateful for her courage. "Stay behind me, and if anything happens, run. Don't look back." We descend the creaky stairs, the lamp casting our giant shadows on the earthen walls. The air grows colder with each step, and a strange smell fills my nose, like wet soil and something rotting. At the bottom of the stairs is a dirt tunnel, barely tall enough for me to stand upright. It stretches ahead into darkness. "This can't be right," Margaret whispers. "This tunnel, it's too big, too long to fit under that small cabin." She's right. It doesn't make sense. But nothing about this forest has made sense since we found those strange tracks. We follow the tunnel, which seems to go on forever. The walls are damp, and sometimes I think I see handprints pressed into the mud, like someone was dragged against their will. After what feels like hours, but is probably only minutes, the tunnel opens into a larger space, a cave with a high ceiling. Water drips somewhere in the darkness. The lamp reveals crude drawings on the walls, stick figures with two long limbs, and above them a larger figure with many arms. "Daniel." Margaret's voice is tight with fear. "Look." In the center of the cave is a pile of clothes, torn, dirty and stained with what looks like blood. I recognize Tommy's red jacket and Jessica's blue sweater. "They were here," I say, picking up the jacket. It's cold and damp, like it's been here for days. As I hold the jacket, something falls from its pocket, a small notebook. I open it, finding a journal written in Tommy's neat handwriting. The first entries are normal, notes about birds he saw, sketches of plants. But the later entries grow stranger. The last entry, dated 3 days ago, reads, "They're watching us from the trees. Jessica says it's just branches moving in the wind, but there is no wind. They whisper at night. They have so many arms. They want us to follow them deeper into the forest. I think we should run, but which way is out? The compass doesn't work anymore. The forest has changed. It's not the same forest we entered." I close the notebook, a chill running down my spine that has nothing to do with the cold. We need to get out of here, I say, tucking the notebook into my pocket. That's when we hear it, a sound like branches scraping against stone, coming from deeper in the cave. What was that? Margaret whispers. I raise my gun, pointing it toward the sound. Stay behind me. We move deeper into the cave, the lamp's light growing dimmer with each step. The scraping sound gets louder, and now I can hear something else. A wet, slithering noise, like something huge dragging itself across the damp floor. The tunnel narrows again, forcing us to crouch. The air grows thicker, harder to breathe. My bad leg throbs with pain, but I push forward. The tunnel suddenly opens into another cave, larger than the first. And there, in the center, are two figures huddled together. Tommy, Jessica, I call out, my voice echoing off the walls. The figures don't move. As we get closer, I can see they're sitting back to back, their hands tied together. Their heads hang down, faces hidden by their hair. Kids, I say, reaching out to touch Tommy's shoulder. He raises his head slowly, and I stumble back in horror. His face is pale, almost gray, and his eyes are completely black, like holes in his face. His mouth opens, but the voice that comes out doesn't sound human. You shouldn't have come, he says, his voice a rasping whisper. Now you can't leave. Jessica raises her head too, her face the same unnatural gray, her eyes the same bottomless. Black, they're hungry, she says in that same inhuman voice. They're always hungry. I grab Margaret's arm, pulling her back toward the tunnel. Run! As we turn, the lamp goes out completely, plunging us into darkness. I can hear Tommy and Jessica moving behind us, their footsteps unnaturally quick. We stumble through the dark. Tunnel, my hands scraping against the rough walls. I can't see anything, but I can hear those things that used to be Tommy and Jessica following us, getting closer. Daniel? Margaret gasps beside me. I can see light ahead. She's right. There's a faint glow at the end of the tunnel. We run toward it, ignoring the pain in my leg, ignoring the scraping sounds that seem to come from all around us now. We burst out of the tunnel, back into the cabin. The trapdoor slams shut behind us, and I hear something heavy sliding across. It's like the sound of the rug being pulled back into place by unseen hands. The cabin is different now. The walls seem to pulse like they're breathing, and through the window I can see it's no longer night. A grey dawn is breaking over the forest. We need to get out of here, I say, pulling Margaret toward the door. But when I open it, what I see outside isn't the forest we entered. The trees are wrong. Too tall, too twisted, and between them, moving in the early morning mist, are tall, thin shapes with too many limbs. They're watching us, waiting for us. And somewhere in the distance I can hear the whispers growing louder. Slam the cabin door shut, my hands shaking so badly I can barely turn the lock. What did you see? Margaret asks, her face pale in the grey light coming through the windows. The forest is wrong, I say, struggling to find words for what I just saw. And there's something out there. Multiple somethings. Margaret peers through a crack in the window boards. Those shapes, they're not human, and neither are Tommy and Jessica anymore, I say, the image of their black eyes still burning in my mind. Or at least, those things down there aren't really them. I check my watch, but the hands have stopped moving. Time feels strange here, stretched and warped like taffy. We need a plan, I say, trying to think clearly despite the fear clouding my mind. We can't stay here, and we can't go back down into that tunnel. Margaret nods, then freezes. Daniel, look at the wall. The words scratched above the fireplace have changed. Now they read, "The forest takes, the forest changes," and below, "Find the heart, burn the heart." What does that mean? Margaret whispers. Before I can answer, we hear a sound from outside, a soft tapping on the door like someone gently knocking. "Hello?" a voice calls. It sounds like Tommy, but normal now, young, frightened. "Is someone in there?" "Please, help us. Don't open it." Margaret grabs my arm. "It's trying to trick us." The knocking gets louder. "Please." Now it sounds like Jessica. They're coming! Let us in! I back away from the door, pulling Margaret with me. It's not them, I whisper. Remember what we saw in the cave. The knocking turns to pounding, the whole cabin shaking with the force of it. The voices outside change, becoming angry, inhuman, a chorus of snarls and hisses that makes my skin crawl. Then, as suddenly as it started, the pounding stops. The silence that follows is almost worse. We need to find another way out, I say, searching the cabin. There are no other doors, and the windows are boarded up from the outside. Margaret kneels by the fireplace, examining the cold ashes. Daniel, look at this. In the ashes is a small metal box. I open it carefully, finding an old map inside. It shows the forest, but not as I know it. There are markings I don't recognize, and in the center, a spot marked with a strange symbol, a circle with lines radiating outward like a sun. The heart of the forest, Margaret says, pointing to the symbol. That must be what the wall message means. I study the map, trying to figure out where we are. Nothing looks familiar. Even if this is the right forest, I say. How do we know where we are on this map? Margaret points to a small X near the edge. This might be the cabin, and look, there's a path leading from it to the heart. It's a slim chance, but it's all we have. I fold the map and tuck it into my pocket. We'll have to make a run for it, I say, checking my gun. Only 3 bullets left. Stay close to me. We stand by the door, gathering our courage. I count to 3, then yank it open. The forest outside is still wrong. The trees too tall, too twisted, but the strange shapes I saw earlier are gone. The path in front of the cabin is clear, winding into the mist-shrouded woods. We step outside, half expecting something to attack us. But nothing moves except the mist, swirling around our ankles like ghostly fingers. This way, I say, consulting. The map. The path should lead us east, toward the heart of the forest. We walk quickly, jumping at every sound, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves. The forest feels alive around us, watching our every move. After about an hour, the path leads us to a clearing. In the center stands a massive tree, bigger than any I've ever seen. Its trunk is wide enough that 10 men holding hands couldn't circle it, and its branches reach so high they disappear into the mist above. That's not on the map, Margaret says, her voice hushed with awe. As we approach the tree, I notice something strange. Faces seem to be carved into its bark. Dozens of them, their expressions frozen in terror. I reach out to touch one, and the bark feels warm, almost like skin. Daniel, Margaret's voice is tight with fear. These faces, they look like missing persons posters I've seen, people who disappeared in these woods over the years. She's right. Now that she mentions it, I recognize some of them, hikers and campers who vanished without a trace. And there, near the bottom, are 2 fresh faces. Tommy and Jessica, their mouths open in silent screams. The forest takes, I whisper, remembering the words on the cabin wall. The forest changes. A sound behind us makes us spin around. Standing at the edge of the clearing is a deer, but wrong somehow. Its legs are too long, its neck bent at an impossible angle, and its eyes are completely black, just like Tommy's and Jessica's were in the cave. The deer watches us for a moment, then turns and bounds away into the trees. It's showing us the way, Margaret says, or leading us into a trap, I counter. But when I check the map again, I see that the direction the deer went matches the path to the heart of the forest. We don't have much choice, I admit. Let's follow, but carefully. We head in the direction the deer went, keeping our distance. The forest grows darker the deeper we go, the trees pressing closer together, blocking out what little daylight filters through the mist. The path leads us to the mouth of a cave, not the same one we found under the cabin, but larger, its entrance shaped like a gaping mouth. The heart of the forest, Margaret says, pointing to the map. The symbol marking the heart is right where this cave should be. From deep inside the cave comes a pulsing red glow like a giant heartbeat. And with each pulse, I can feel the ground beneath our feet trembling slightly. "What is that?" Margaret whispers. "I don't know," I say, drawing my gun. "But find the heart. Burn the heart. That's what we need to do." We step into the cave, the red glow growing stronger as we move deeper. The walls are covered with the same strange drawings we saw in the tunnel. Stick figures with too many limbs, and above them, a larger figure that seems to be controlling them. The cave opens into a massive chamber, and what we see there stops us in our tracks. In the center of the chamber is a huge, pulsing mass, red and wet-looking, like a giant heart. Veins or roots stretch from it, digging into the walls and floor of the cave. And surrounding it are dozens of those tall, thin creatures with too many arms. They're gathered around the heart, swaying in time with its beats. They have no faces, just smooth, blank skin where features should be, and kneeling before the heart, their backs to us, are two familiar figures, Tommy and Jessica, or what used to be them. "We found it," I whisper to Margaret. "The heart of the forest." As if hearing my words, all the faceless creatures turn toward us at once, and the hunt begins. The faceless creatures move toward us, their too many limbs bending in ways that make my stomach turn. They don't run. They glide, like shadows sliding across the cave floor. "Run!" I shout, grabbing Margaret's arm and pulling her back toward the cave entrance. We sprint through the tunnel, the sound of slithering bodies close behind us. I risk a glance back and immediately wish I hadn't. The creatures are gaining on us, their blank faces somehow more terrifying than any monster with fangs or claws. "We can't outrun them," Margaret gasps as we burst out of the cave into the forest. She's right. My bad leg is already burning with pain, slowing us down. We need another plan. "The heart," I say, remembering the message on the cabin wall. "We need to burn the heart." Margaret looks at me like I'm crazy. "How? We'd have to get past those things first." I pull out my lighter, the silver Zippo Emma gave me before I went to Korea. "It's almost out of fuel, but it might be enough." "I'll distract them," I say, making a quick decision. "You circle around and get to the heart." "That's suicide," Margaret argues. "Got a better idea?" I ask, checking my gun again. 3 bullets, not nearly enough. Before she can answer, the first of the creatures emerges from the cave. Its blank face turns toward us, and though it has no eyes, I can feel it seeing us. "Go!" I shove the lighter into Margaret's hand and step forward, raising my gun. "Hey, over here!" I fire a shot into the air. The sound echoes through the forest, and all the creatures turn toward me. Good. That's what I wanted. I start running, away from Margaret, away from the cave. My leg screams in protest, but fear gives me speed I didn't know I had. I can hear them behind me, getting closer with each second. I duck behind a tree, then fire another shot, this time at the nearest creature. The bullet hits it square in the chest, but it doesn't even flinch. It just keeps coming. 1 bullet left. I run again, zigging and zagging between trees. The forest seems to be helping the creatures, roots rising up to trip me, branches reaching down to grab at my clothes. I stumble and fall, my bad leg finally giving out. I roll onto my back, raising my gun as the creatures surround me. Their blank faces lean in, curious, like children examining a bug. One of them reaches for me with 2 long fingers. I fire my last bullet at it, but again it has no effect. This is it, I think. This is how I die. Then I hear Margaret's voice, shouting from the direction of the cave, "Daniel, cover your eyes!" I throw my arm over my face, just as a blinding flash lights up the forest. The creatures around me shriek, a sound like metal scraping on metal, and rear back. I scramble to my feet, ignoring the pain in my leg, and run toward the cave. The creatures are disoriented, bumping into each other, their limbs flailing wildly. Inside the cave, I find Margaret standing before the giant heart. She's used my lighter to set fire to her jacket, which she's thrown onto the pulsing mass. The heart is burning, black smoke pouring from it as it beats faster and faster. We need to get out of here, Margaret shouts over the sound of the heart's frantic beating. We run for the exit, but halfway there, Margaret stumbles. I turn back to help her and freeze. Her face. Something's wrong with her face. It's shifting, changing. One moment it's Margaret, the next it's someone else entirely. Margaret? I back away from her. She looks up at me, and her eyes are black, completely black, like Tommy's and Jessica's in the tunnel. You don't understand, Daniel, she says, her voice no longer her own. It's deeper, older somehow. The forest has always been here. It will always be here. Who are you? I demand, though I think I already know the answer. She smiles, and it's not Margaret's smile. I am the forest, or part of it, just as you will be soon. Behind her, the burning heart beats faster, the cave walls shaking with each pulse. Cracks appear in the ceiling, rocks beginning to fall. The forest takes, not Margaret says, the forest changes. I back away from her toward the exit. What happened to the real Margaret? There never was a real Margaret, she says, advancing on me, just as there never was a real Tommy or Jessica. The forest creates what it needs to lure in new hearts. My mind reels. If Margaret was never real, then who have I been traveling with this whole time? What happened to the real teenagers? The children are part of the forest now, not Margaret says, as if reading my thoughts. Just as you will be, just as all who enter the deep woods during the first snow become part of us. More rocks fall from the ceiling as the heart's beating grows more erratic. The cave is collapsing. You're dying, I say, gesturing to the burning heart. Your trick didn't work this time. Not. Margaret's face twists in anger. We have existed for thousands of years. We have taken hundreds of hearts. Yours will join them. She lunges at me, her body changing as she moves, limbs elongating, fingers stretching into claws. I dodge, but she's fast, catching my jacket and pulling me toward her. I struggle, but her strength is inhuman. She drags me toward the burning heart, which is now beating so fast it's almost a continuous roar. Join us, Daniel, she hisses in my ear. Be part of something ancient, something powerful. I reach into my pocket, feeling for anything I can use as a weapon. My fingers close around my father's K-bar knife. I pull it out, and with all my strength, drive it into not Margaret's chest. She screams, a sound no human throat could make, and releases me. I fall to the ground as she staggers back, black liquid pouring from the wound. You cannot kill the forest, she growls, her voice distorting, multiplying into many voices speaking at once. We are eternal. Maybe, I say, getting to my feet, but I can hurt you. I turn and run for the exit as the cave continues to collapse around me. Behind me, not Margaret's screams blend with the sound of the dying heart. I burst out of the cave, just as it collapses completely, sealing not Margaret and the heart inside. The ground shakes beneath my feet, and all around me, the twisted trees of the forest begin to wither and die. The faceless creatures are gone, or perhaps they're dying too, as the heart that controls them burns away to nothing. I stand there, breathing hard, watching as the forest, the wrong forest, dies around me. In the distance, I can see normal trees emerging from the mist, the real forest returning as the evil at its heart is destroyed. But I know this isn't over. Not Margaret said it herself. The forest is ancient, eternal. I may have hurt it, but I haven't killed it. And as the last of the twisted trees crumbles to dust, I hear a whisper on the wind until the next first snow. I don't know how long I walked through the forest. Hours, maybe. My leg hurt with every step, and my mind kept replaying everything I'd seen. The faces in the tree, the giant heart, Margaret changing into something else. The twisted trees were gone now, replaced by normal pines and oaks. The snow looked ordinary again, not the strange blue-white it had been before. Even the air felt different. Cleaner, lighter. I should have felt relieved, but all I felt was numb. What had happened to the real Tommy and Jessica? Were they really gone, absorbed by the forest? And Margaret, had she ever been real, or was she always one of those things? As the sun began to set, I finally spotted something through the trees. The ranger station. I almost cried at the sight of it, so normal and solid after everything I'd been through. Frank Calloway was standing outside talking to Sheriff Blackwell. When they saw me stumbling out of the trees, they both ran toward me. "Daniel, my God, where have you been?" Frank grabbed my arm, helping me walk. "You've been gone for 3 days. We had search parties out looking for you." 3 days? It had felt like only one long, terrible night. The teenagers, I mumbled, my voice hoarse from thirst. Tommy and Jessica. "We found them yesterday," Sheriff Blackwell said, his usual bored expression replaced with concern. "They were wandering near the highway, confused and dehydrated, but alive. Said they got lost in the storm." I stopped walking, staring at him. "They're alive." "But I saw them. They were—" Frank and the sheriff exchanged worried looks. "Let's get you inside," Frank said gently. "You need a doctor." They led me into the ranger station, sat me down, gave me water. A doctor came and checked me over, saying words like exposure and dehydration and possible hallucinations. I tried to tell them what I'd seen, the cabin, the cave, the heart of the forest, but I could see in their eyes they didn't believe me. How could they? It sounded crazy, even to me, and I'd lived through it. "What about Dr. Wilson?" I asked finally. "Margaret Wilson, the biologist who went into the forest with me." Another concerned look between Frank and the sheriff. "Daniel," Frank said slowly, "you went into the forest alone. There is no Dr. Margaret Wilson working in this area." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with my wet clothes, but she was with me. She helped me find the heart of the forest. I trailed off, remembering not Margaret's words. There never was a real Margaret. The doctor gave me something to help me sleep, and I spent the night in the small medical room at the ranger station. My dreams were filled with faceless creatures and burning hearts, and Margaret's face shifting into something inhuman. In the morning, I felt more clear-headed. Frank drove me to the hospital in town for more tests and then home to my cabin. He wanted me to take a week off, maybe more. "You've been through a lot," he said, concern etched on his weathered face. "Whatever happened out there, you need time to process it." I nodded, not bothering to try explaining again. What was the point? They'd never believe me. After Frank left, I sat on my porch, staring at the edge of the forest in the distance. It looked so peaceful, so normal. Had I imagined everything? Was it all just hallucinations brought on by the cold and stress? But then I reached into my pocket and felt something. Tommy's notebook. I pulled it out, flipping through the pages until I found the last entry. "They're watching us from the trees." So it was real, all of it. I went inside and called the hospital, asking about Tommy and Jessica. The nurse told me they were doing fine, expected to make a full recovery. They didn't remember much about their time in the forest, just getting lost in the snow, then wandering until they found the highway. Their memories had been taken or changed, just like the forest had tried to take me. Over the next few weeks, I tried to return to normal life. I went back to work, patrolling the safer parts of the forest. I avoided the area where we'd found the teenagers' campsite. I told myself it was over. But then the first snow of the next year came early again, and with it, reports of a missing hiker. I volunteered to join the search party, ignoring Frank's concerned looks. I knew what was out there. I knew what to look for. As we prepared to head into the forest, a woman approached our group. She introduced herself as Dr. Emily Parker, a geologist studying the area. "I'd like to join the search," she said. "I know these woods pretty well." Something about her seemed familiar, the way she smiled, the confidence in her voice. For a moment, I thought I saw her face shift, revealing something else underneath. But when I blinked, she was just a woman again, looking at me expectantly. "Have we met before?" I asked. my hand instinctively moving to the knife at my belt. "I don't think so," she said, but there was something in her eyes, a knowledge, a hunger. The forest was calling again. The forest was hunting, and this time I was ready. As we headed into the trees, snow crunching beneath our boots, I heard a whisper on the wind, so faint I almost missed it. "Welcome back, Daniel." My name is Wesley Harding, but everyone calls me Wes. I've been a park ranger at Olympic National Park for almost 5 years now. Before that, I was in Vietnam, Force Recon Marine from 68 to 72. I came to the forest to forget the war, but sometimes the shadows here remind me of the jungle over there. It's August 1978, and we're in the middle of the worst drought anyone can remember. The trees are thirsty, the animals are desperate, and the forest feels wrong somehow, like it's holding its breath, waiting for something. I was sitting at my desk in the ranger station when Chief Peterson walked in, his face more serious than usual. He dropped a file on my desk. 3 hiking groups gone missing in 2 months, all in Blackwater Valley, he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. And there's something else. Animals turning up dead, but not like normal dead. They're empty. "Empty?" I asked, opening the file. The photos made my stomach turn. A deer, perfectly intact from the outside, but when they cut it open, nothing inside. No organs, no blood, no bones. Just skin and fur like a hollow costume. "Probably some disease," Chief Peterson said, not sounding convinced. "Or predators doing weird things because of the heat. Either way, I need you to check it out." I nodded, running my finger over the small chip in my pocket. 18 months sober now. The forest had helped me stay that way, even when the nightmares came. "You're not going alone," Peterson added. "I'm assigning Collins to go with you." I groaned. Timothy Collins was fresh out of training, eager, talkative, and green as spring leaves. "Chief, I work better alone." "Not this time, Harding. Take the kid, show him the ropes. And Wes?" He paused at the door. "Try not to scare him with your ghost stories." That afternoon, I met Timothy at the trailhead. He had everything neatly packed. His uniform still creased and new. His smile was too big for his face. "Ranger Harding, I've heard so much about you. Is it true you tracked that lost family through a blizzard last winter?" "Just Wes," I said, checking my own gear. "Compass, knife, first aid kit, and my old Polaroid camera. I liked having pictures, proof of what I saw out there. And yes, it's true. Let's hope this is simpler." We hiked for hours, the sun beating down through the trees. The forest was too quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering, just the crunch of our boots and Timothy's endless questions. "So, what exactly are we looking for?" he asked as we crossed a nearly dry stream bed. I stopped, pointing to a tree ahead of us. Deep cuts marked the bark, forming a pattern I'd never seen before. "We're looking for whatever did that," I said. "And whatever's making animals turn up hollow." Timothy touched the marks, tracing the pattern. "Could be teenagers with knives," I shook my head. "These cuts are too deep, too precise, and they're on trees throughout this whole section." I didn't tell him how the patterns reminded me of the symbols I'd seen carved into village huts in Vietnam, warnings to keep away. As the sun began to set, we made camp near what was left of a small pond, now just a muddy puddle. The drought had hit hard here, turning the normally lush forest into a tinderbox, waiting for a spark. "We'll head into Blackwater Valley tomorrow," I told Timothy as we ate our dinner. "That's where all 3 hiking groups disappeared." "What do you think happened to them?" Timothy asked, his eyes wide in the firelight. I thought about the hollow deer, the strange markings, and the silence in the forest. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but something tells me we're going to find out." That night, I dreamed of Vietnam. Again, I was back in the tunnel, the earth collapsing around me, but when I finally clawed my way out, I wasn't in the jungle anymore. I was in Blackwater Valley, and something was watching me from inside the trees. I woke up covered in sweat, my hand already on my knife. Across the dying fire, Timothy slept peacefully. Above us, the trees seemed to lean closer, as if listening to our breathing. Tomorrow we would enter the valley, and I had a feeling that whatever waited for us there had been waiting a very long time. Morning came with a heavy fog that hung between the trees like cobwebs. I woke Timothy up and we packed our gear in silence. Something about this place made you want to whisper. "We should reach Blackwater Valley by noon," I told him, checking my compass. The needle spun lazily, not settling on north like it should. I tapped it a few times, but it kept spinning. "That's weird," Timothy said, looking over my shoulder. "Is it broken?" Maybe. But I'd had this compass for years, through rain and snow and worse. It had never failed me before. I put it away and looked at the sun instead. This way. We hiked for about an hour when we found the first hollow animal, a raccoon lying on its side near a fallen log. From the outside, it looked perfectly normal. Could be rabies, Timothy suggested, or maybe it just died from the heat. I crouched down and gently turned it over with a stick. The underside split open like a paper bag, revealing nothing inside. No bones, no organs, just empty skin and fur. Timothy stumbled back. That's what the report mentioned," I said, taking out my Polaroid. I snapped a picture, the flash bright in the morning gloom. "Whatever did this took everything. Inside without breaking the skin." "No animal hunts like that," Timothy said, his voice shaking a little. "No animal we know," I agreed. We found 2 more hollow creatures before reaching the edge of Blackwater Valley, a rabbit and a fox, both empty inside. I took pictures of each one, watching the images slowly develop in my hands. The valley spread. Out below us, a deep bowl of trees surrounded by mountains. A thin river snaked through it, now barely a trickle in the drought. From up here it looked peaceful, but my skin prickled with goosebumps. "Doesn't look so scary," Timothy said, but his voice was tight. "Let's check in with base before we go down," I said, pulling out my radio. All I got was static. I tried again, adjusting the frequency. More static, but underneath it, something that sounded almost like whispering. Probably the mountains blocking. "The signal," Timothy offered. "Probably," I said, though I didn't believe it. We started down the trail into the valley. The trees grew thicker here, older, their branches twisting together overhead to block out the sun. The air felt heavier, harder to breathe. "Chief Peterson said one of the hikers made it out," Timothy said as we walked. "A woman named Diane Lawson. She's in the hospital now." I nodded. "We'll talk to her when we get back. For now, let's focus on finding any sign of the others." Around midday, we found our first real clue. A campsite, abandoned but not packed up. 2 tents still stood, though one had collapsed. Backpacks leaned against a tree, and a cooking pot sat on a cold fire ring. "This must be from the second group," I said, looking through my file. "The Millers and their friends. 4 adults went missing 3 weeks ago." Timothy unzipped one of the tents and looked inside. "Their sleeping bags are still here, clothes too." I searched through the backpacks, finding wallets, keys, a camera. They didn't pack up, they just left. "Or were taken," Timothy added. Quietly, I found a journal in one of the packs and flipped through it. It belonged to Karen Miller, filled with notes about their hike and sketches of plants and animals. The last entry was from 3 weeks ago. Day 3 in the valley. Dave isn't feeling well. Says his skin feels tight, found strange markings on trees around camp. John thinks they're from some kind of animal, but they look almost like writing to me. The forest is so quiet here, no birds, hard to sleep with the whispering. "Whispering?" Timothy asked, reading over my shoulder. I closed the journal and put it in my pack. "Let's keep looking." We searched the area for hours, but found no signs of struggle. No blood, no footprints leading away, just an abandoned camp, as if the hikers had simply vanished into thin air. As the afternoon wore on, We pushed deeper into the valley. The trees here were different, their bark darker, with patches that looked almost transparent in places, like you could see through to something moving underneath. "Wes!" Timothy called, his voice strange. "You need to see this." He was standing by a large oak tree, staring at something on the ground. When I reached him, I saw what had caught his attention. A perfect circle of mushrooms, white with red. Spots surrounding a dark patch of earth. In the center of the circle lay a pile of clothes, jeans, a flannel shirt, hiking boots, arranged as if someone was still wearing them, but empty. I took out my Polaroid and snapped a picture. When the image developed, I nearly dropped it. In the photo, the clothes weren't empty. There was a shape inside them, hazy and transparent, but definitely human-shaped. "What is it?" Timothy asked, seeing my face. I handed him the photo. "Something our eyes can't see, but the camera can." Timothy looked from the photo to the empty clothes and back again. "That's impossible." "So are hollow animals," I said, putting the photo in my pocket. "We need to make camp before dark. Not here." We found a small clearing about half a mile away and set up our tent. Neither of us mentioned the clothes or the photo as we ate our dinner, but I could tell Timothy was scared. Truth be told, so was I. That night, as we sat by our small fire, Timothy finally asked the question I'd been avoiding. "What do you think is happening here, Wes?" I stared into the flames, thinking about the hollow animals, the abandoned camp, the clothes with the invisible person inside them. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but whatever it is, it's not natural." In the darkness beyond our fire, something moved between the trees. Not an animal. The movement was too fluid, too purposeful. I reached for my flashlight, but by the time I turned it on, whatever it was had disappeared. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Timothy nodded, his face pale in the firelight. "What was it?" "Get in the tent," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Keep your knife close." That night, neither of us slept much. The forest around us filled with sounds, not animal sounds, but something like whispers just below the level of hearing. And once I could have sworn I heard someone call my name in a voice that sounded like rustling leaves. When morning finally came, I found strange markings scratched into the dirt around our tent, the same pattern we'd seen on the trees. And Timothy had a rash on his arm that he couldn't explain. Red lines forming the same pattern, as if it had been pressed into his skin while he slept. The next morning, I checked Timothy's rash. The red lines had spread up his arm, forming patterns, like the ones we'd seen on the trees. "Does it hurt?" I asked. He shook his head. "It just feels weird, like my skin is too tight." That matched what Karen Miller wrote about her husband in the journal. I didn't like it one bit. "We need to keep moving," I said. "Find out what happened to those hikers." We packed up camp and headed deeper into Blackwater Valley. The trees grew. Stranger the further we went, bark peeling away in places to reveal something underneath that looked almost like clear jelly. The ground felt spongy beneath our boots, and the air smelled like wet leaves and something else I couldn't name. Radio kept picking up that strange whispering. Sometimes it almost sounded like words, but when I tried to make them out, they slipped away like smoke. Around noon, we found a small cabin hidden among the trees. It was old, the wood gray with age, but someone had been there recently. Fresh footprints led to the door. "Hello?" I called out, my hand on my knife. "Park rangers, anyone here?" No answer. I pushed the door open slowly. The inside was simple. One room with a bed, a table, and a wood stove. But the walls were covered with photographs. Hundreds of them, pinned, up in rows, all Polaroids like the ones I took. "What is this place?" Timothy whispered. I moved closer to look at the photos. They showed the forest, the valley, the strange markings on trees. But in many of them, there were shapes. Hazy, transparent figures standing between trees or crouched by the river. Things our eyes couldn't see, but the camera could. On the table was a notebook, open to a page filled with messy handwriting. They're getting clearer every day. The drought is thinning the walls between us. They've been here all along, watching us, waiting. I can hear them now, even when I'm not asleep. They want something from us. They want in. The last word was underlined 3 times. Wes, Timothy said, his voice shaking. He was looking at a photo pinned above the bed. It showed our campsite from last night. We were both asleep in our tent, but standing over us were 3 tall, thin shapes, their bodies partly see-through, like looking at someone underwater. I felt cold all over. We need to leave, now. As we turned to go, I noticed something else, a small wooden box on the floor by the bed. I opened it and found a stack of old newspaper clippings. The headlines jumped out at me. 5 hikers missing in Olympic National. Park 1952. Search called off for lost research team 1967. Strange animal deaths. Puzzle scientists 1978. This had happened before. Whatever was happening in Blackwater Valley, it wasn't new. We left the cabin quickly, both of us looking over our shoulders. The forest seemed to watch us now, the trees leaning in too close, the shadows too deep. Who do you think lived there? Timothy asked as we walked. I don't know. Maybe one of the missing hikers found something and stayed to study it. Or maybe whatever's out here can look like us sometimes, Timothy said quietly. I didn't answer that. I didn't want to think about it. By late afternoon, we reached the center of the valley, where the river had nearly dried up. Only a thin stream of water remained, flowing between rocks covered in a strange, shiny film. Let's fill our canteens while we can, I said. The water looks clean enough. As Timothy bent down by the stream, I took out my compass again. The needle still wouldn't settle, spinning lazily around and around. I checked my watch. The hands were moving too fast, spinning through hours in minutes. That's impossible, I muttered. What is it? Timothy asked, standing up. I showed him my watch. Something's wrong with time here. He checked his own watch. Mine's doing the same thing. How is that possible? I don't know. But I think we should... A sound cut me off, a low moaning call that echoed through the trees. Not an animal sound, not a human sound either. What was that? Timothy whispered. I don't know, but we should... The sound came again, closer this time. Something was moving through the trees toward us, something big. Run, I said, grabbing Timothy's arm. Now! We ran through the forest, branches whipping at our faces. I could hear it behind us, moving fast, not bothering with quiet anymore. The sound it made was like nothing I'd ever heard, a high, keening wail that made my teeth hurt. We burst into a small clearing and stopped short. Ahead of us, the ground dropped away into a steep ravine. Behind us, the thing was getting closer. This way, I said, pulling Timothy toward a narrow path that ran along the edge of the ravine. We followed it for maybe half a mile before it widened into another clearing. In the center stood a circle of stones, each one covered in the same markings. We'd seen on the trees... What is this place? Timothy asked, breathing hard. Before I could answer, I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. A man stepped out of the trees, old, with long grey hair and dark skin. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt, but no shoes. You shouldn't be here, he said, his voice rough like he didn't use it much. This place isn't for your kind anymore. Who? Are you? I asked, keeping my hand near my knife. Michael Redfeather. I live on the edge of the park. He looked at Timothy, his eyes narrowing. Your friend is changing. Timothy touched the rash on his arm. What do you mean? Michael stepped closer. The forest is hungry. The drought has made it desperate. It's looking for new ways to grow. What are you talking about? I demanded. The old ones called this place where the world's skin is thinnest. Things can come through here, from the other side. And now, with the drought, he shook his head. The barrier is breaking down. I thought about the hollow animals, the invisible figures in my photos. the whispering on my radio. "What's happening to my friend?" I asked. Michael looked at Timothy with sad eyes. "The forest is claiming him. It starts with the skin. Patterns appear like the ones on the trees. Then the dreams come. You hear voices, see things that aren't there. Or maybe they are there, and you're just starting to see them for the first time." Timothy's face went pale. "How do you know all this?" "Because it happened to my grandfather 50 years ago, and to others before him. Every few decades, when the forest gets hungry." I didn't want to believe him. It sounded crazy, but after what we'd seen... "How do we stop it?" I asked. Michael shook his head. "You don't. You leave before it happens to you too." "We can't leave," I said. "There are people missing. We need to find them." "They're already part of the forest now," Michael said, "or they will be soon." As the sun began to set, we made camp near the stone circle. Michael stayed with us, though he wouldn't come too close, to Timothy. That night I woke to find Timothy gone from his sleeping bag. I found him standing at the edge of the clearing, staring into the dark forest. He was whispering something over and over. "They're coming through. They're coming through." When I touched his shoulder, he turned to look at me, but his eyes were different. The pupils stretched into vertical slits, like a cat's. "Timothy," I said, my voice shaking. He blinked, and his eyes were normal again. "Wes, what's happening?" To me, I didn't have an answer. I just led him back to camp, where Michael watched us with knowing eyes. "The forest has chosen him," he said quietly. "There's nothing you can do now but watch." The next morning, Timothy's condition was worse. The rash had spread across his chest, and his skin looked almost see-through in places. He kept scratching at it, even though I told him to stop. "It feels like something's moving under there," he said, his voice shaky. Michael watched us from across the camp, his eyes sad. "It's progressing faster than usual," he said. "Must be the drought. The forest is desperate." I tried my radio again, hoping to call for help. All I got was that strange whispering, louder now. It almost sounded like words, but in a language I couldn't understand. "We need to get Timothy out of here," I told Michael. "Back to the ranger station," he shook his head. "It's too late for that. The forest won't let him leave now." I didn't want to believe him, but when we tried to hike back the way we came, Timothy got sicker with every step. After just half a mile, he collapsed, shaking and sweating. "We have to go back," he gasped. "It hurts to leave." So we returned to the stone circle, and Timothy immediately felt better. It was like the forest itself was keeping him here. As the day went on, strange things started happening. Time seemed to jump around. One minute it was morning, the next it was late afternoon. My watch had stopped working completely. Timothy's behavior got weirder too. He would stare at trees for hours, whispering to them. Sometimes I'd catch him drawing those strange symbols in the dirt with a stick. "What are you doing?" I asked him once. He looked up at me, confused. I'm not sure. It just feels right." That night I woke up to find Timothy gone again. I found him standing in the middle of the stone circle, his arms raised to the sky. The stones were glowing faintly, pulsing with a soft light. "Timothy?" I called out, my voice shaking. He turned to look at me, and I stumbled back. His eyes were glowing too, with the same soft light as the stones. "They're coming through, Wes," he said, his voice sounding strange and far away. "The thinning is almost complete." I grabbed him, trying to pull him out of the circle. As soon as I touched him, images flashed through my mind, trees with eyes, the ground breathing like it was alive, strange shapes moving just out of sight. I let go with a yell and fell backwards. Timothy didn't seem to notice. He just kept staring at the sky, smiling. Michael appeared beside me, helping me up. "It's starting," he said grimly. "The merging." "What does that mean?" I asked, my heart pounding. "The forest is making him part of itself. Soon he won't be human anymore." I looked at Timothy, still standing in the glowing circle. His skin was almost completely transparent now. I could see things moving underneath, not blood or organs, but something that looked like roots or vines. How do we stop it? I demanded. Michael shook his head. We can't, but maybe we can slow it down. There's an old research station deeper in the valley. It was abandoned years ago, but they were studying the forest. Maybe there's something there that can help. I nodded, trying to stay calm. Okay, we'll go there in the morning. But when morning came, things got worse. Timothy wouldn't wake up. He just lay there, his chest barely moving, roots visibly growing under his skin. I tried to pick him up, to carry him, but he was too heavy, like he was rooted to the ground. We have to leave him, Michael said softly. If we want to find a way to help him, we need to go now. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, leaving Timothy there, but I knew Michael was right. If there was any chance of saving him, we had to find it fast. As we hiked deeper into the valley, the forest got stranger. The trees looked less like trees and more like something out of a dream or a nightmare. Their branches moved without, wind reaching for us as we passed. My head started to hurt, and I kept seeing things out of the corner of my eye, shapes moving just out of sight, faces in the bark of trees. Are you seeing this too? I asked Michael. He nodded grimly. The veil between worlds is getting thinner. We're starting to see what's always been there, hidden just out of sight. We walked for what felt like hours, though my broken watch made it hard to tell. Finally, we came to a small clearing. In the center stood a building, old and overgrown, but clearly man-made. The research station, Michael said. As we got closer, I saw that the walls were covered in the same symbols we'd seen everywhere. But these looked older, like they'd been carved decades ago. The door was locked, but it was old and rotten. One good kick and it swung open. Inside it was dark and musty. Old equipment was scattered around. Microscopes, sample jars, file cabinets. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. What were they studying here? I asked, shining my flashlight. Around the forest, Michael said. Its patterns, its hunger. I started looking through the old files while Michael checked the equipment. Most of the papers were too faded to read, but I found one folder that was still clear. The label read, Project Hollow. Inside were reports of experiments, photos of plants and animals that looked wrong, mutated. There were notes about cellular restructuring and biomass conversion. One photo made me stop cold. It showed a man, or what used to be a man. His skin was transparent, and inside, instead of organs, there were plants growing, roots and vines, twisted where his heart should have been. Michael! I called, my voice shaking. I think I know what's happening to Timothy. He came over and looked at the photo. His face went pale. The forest isn't just changing him, he said quietly. It's replacing him, making a new body for itself, using him as a template. I felt sick. How do we stop it? Before Michael could answer, we heard a sound from outside, a low, moaning call, the same sound we'd heard before when we were running. We looked at each other, both knowing what it meant. They've found us, Michael said. Through the dirty windows, I could see shapes moving in the forest. Tall, thin figures that seemed to shift and change as they moved. And they were coming towards us. What do we do? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Michael looked around the room, then pointed to a door in the back. There. That leads to the underground levels. We might find something down there to help us. I nodded, grabbing as many files as I could carry. Let's go. As we ran for the door, I heard the main entrance crash open behind us. Something was inside the building. Now something big. We didn't look back. We just ran down into the darkness beneath the forest, hoping to find answers before whatever was chasing us caught up. The stairs led us down into darkness. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick, dusty air. The walls were concrete here, cold and damp. What is this place? I whispered. The real research station, Michael said. What's upstairs was just for show. We reached the bottom of the stairs and found ourselves in a long hallway. Doors lined both sides, each marked with faded numbers. From somewhere above, I could hear movement, heavy footsteps getting closer. In here, Michael said, pushing open one of the doors. We slipped inside and closed the door behind us. The room was filled with old equipment, machines I didn't recognize, with dials and switches covered in dust. Glass tanks lined one wall, most of them empty, but a few contained things. Plants that didn't look like any plants I'd ever seen, preserved in yellowish liquid. What were they doing here? I asked, moving closer to examine one of the tanks. Inside was what looked like a fern, but it had something like eyes along its stems. Studying the forest, Michael said, looking through. Papers on a desk, trying to understand it. I moved to another tank. This one held what might have been a rabbit once, but its skin was transparent, and inside, instead of organs, were tiny plants growing. Like Timothy, I said quietly. Michael nodded. The forest has been doing this for a long time. These scientists were trying to figure out how and why. I picked up a folder from the desk and opened it. Inside were more photos and reports. One caught my eye, a map of Blackwater Valley with circles drawn in red, marking spots where people had disappeared. The dates went back over 100 years. This has been happening in cycles, I said, showing Michael the map. Every 20 to 30 years. He nodded grimly. During droughts, mostly, when the forest is stressed. From upstairs came a crash, loud enough to make dust fall from the ceiling. Whatever was up there was searching for us. We need to keep moving, Michael said. We slipped back into the hallway and tried another door. This room was different, smaller, with a projector set up facing a blank wall. Look, I said, pointing to a film reel sitting on a table. The label read, Specimen 17, Transformation Process. Should we watch it? Michael asked. I hesitated, then nodded. We need to understand what we're dealing with. Michael set up the projector while I kept watch at the door. When he turned it on, the wall lit up with flickering black and white images. The film showed a man strapped to a table. He looked normal at first, but as the film progressed, his skin began to change, becoming transparent in patches. The camera zoomed in to show plants growing underneath, tiny at first, then larger. The man was awake through it all, his mouth moving like he was talking or screaming, though the film had no sound. By the end, he wasn't human anymore. His body was just a shell, filled with plants that moved on their own. In the final shot, the thing that used to be a man sat up and looked directly at the camera. Its eyes were empty, but somehow aware. The film ended, leaving us in darkness until I clicked my flashlight back on. They were experimenting on people, I said, feeling sick. Or documenting what the forest was doing, Michael replied. Either. Way, we know what's happening to Timothy now. Another crash from upstairs, closer this time. We needed to move. The next room we found was larger than the others. Metal tables stood in rows, and on each table was a skin. Human skins, empty and flat, like costumes waiting to be worn. Some were old and dried out, others looked fresher. Oh God, I whispered, my stomach turning. The hollowed ones, Michael said. What's left after the forest is done. I forced myself to look closer at one of the skins. It was completely empty. No blood, no tissue, just skin, like the animals we'd found in the forest. How is this possible? I asked. The forest doesn't just replace the inside with plants, Michael explained, looking at notes pinned to a board. It absorbs everything, blood, organs, bones, uses them to feed itself. All that's left is the skin, and eventually it takes that. A loud thump came from directly above us, making us both jump. Something had found the stairs. There's another way out, Michael said, pointing to a door at the back of the room. That leads to the cave system under the valley. We hurried to the door and pushed it open. Beyond was a narrow tunnel carved into the rock, leading down into darkness. As we stepped into the tunnel, I heard the door to the room burst open behind us. I turned, raising my flashlight. Standing in the doorway was Timothy, or what used to be Timothy. His body was there, but his skin was completely transparent now, like glass. Inside, plants grew where his organs should be, pulsing with a soft green light. His eyes were gone, replaced by small white flowers. "Timothy," I whispered. The thing that had been Timothy tilted its head, like it was listening. Then it spoke, but the voice wasn't human anymore. It sounded like rustling leaves and creaking wood. "Wesley Harding," it said. "The forest knows your name." I backed away, bumping into Michael. "Run," he whispered. "Now!" We turned and ran down the tunnel, the sound of something large moving behind us. My flashlight beam bounced wildly off the walls, showing glimpses of roots growing through the rock, reaching for us. The tunnel opened into a larger cave, where water had carved out a hollow in the rock. We stopped, catching our breath. "What was that?" I gasped. "What happened to Timothy?" "The forest is using him now," Michael said. "Using his body, his memories. It knows who you are." I leaned against the wall, trying to think. There has to be a way to stop this, to save him. Michael shook his head. "The only records I found talked about burning. Fire is the only thing the forest fears." As if in response to his words, a tremor ran through the cave. Dust and small rocks fell from the ceiling. "What was that?" I asked. Michael's eyes widened. "Smoke," he said, sniffing the air. "There's a fire above us. I smelled it too now, the sharp scent of burning wood." "The forest is burning," Michael said. "The drought made it dry. One spark would be enough." Another tremor, stronger this time. The fire was spreading fast. "We need to get out of here," I said. "Find a way to the surface." But as we turned to move deeper into the cave system, hoping to find another exit, I saw something in the darkness ahead. Many somethings moving towards us. Tall, thin shapes, glowing faintly with that same green light we'd seen inside Timothy. They moved like people, but not quite right. Too fluid, too graceful. "The forest's children," Michael whispered. "The ones who've already changed." They were coming from one direction, and behind us, the thing that had been Timothy was coming from the other. We were trapped. My heart was pounding as I looked from the strange, glowing figures ahead to the thing that used to be Timothy behind. We were trapped, with no way out. "What do we do?" I whispered to Michael. Before he could answer, the cave shook again. Bigger rocks fell this time, and I could hear a roaring sound from above. The forest fire was getting closer. Suddenly, the figures stopped moving. They all turned their heads at the same time, like they were listening to something we couldn't hear. Then as one, they started backing away into the darkness. "They're afraid of the fire," Michael said. "It's our only chance. We need to find a way up." We ran deeper into the cave, following the retreating figures. The tunnel twisted and turned, going up and down. I lost all sense of direction, just focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. The air was getting hotter, and I could smell smoke more strongly now. We were getting closer to the surface. Finally, we turned a corner and saw light ahead. Not the green glow of the forest creatures, but orange. Firelight, we emerged from the cave into a nightmare. The forest was burning all around us. Trees crackling and falling. The sky was dark with smoke, lit up by the flames. "There!" Michael shouted, pointing to a rocky path that led up the side of the valley. "That's our way out!" We started climbing, the heat of the fire at our backs. I could hear things moving in the burning forest, not animals, but those strange forest creatures trying to escape the flames. Halfway up the path, I heard a familiar voice call my name. I turned and saw Timothy, the real Timothy, not the plant, thing he'd become. He was standing in a clearing, waving at me. "Wes, help me!" he called. I started to move towards him, but Michael grabbed my arm. "It's not real," he said. It's the forest, trying to trick you. As if to prove his point, Timothy flickered like a bad TV signal. For a moment, I saw the plant creature underneath. "Come on," Michael said. "We're almost out." We kept climbing, the path getting steeper. My lungs burned from the smoke and my legs felt like lead, but we couldn't stop. Not now. Just as we reached the top of the ridge, I heard a loud crack. I turned to see a massive tree falling right towards us. "Look out!" I yelled, pushing Michael out of the way. The tree crashed down, missing us by inches. But the impact shook the ground and I lost my balance. I felt myself falling, tumbling, down the slope we'd just climbed. I hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me. As I gasped for breath, I saw something moving towards me through the smoke. It was the Timothy creature, its plant-filled body glowing in the firelight. It reached out a hand, Timothy's hand, but not Timothy's anymore. "Wesley Harding," it said in that strange, rustling voice, "the forest has chosen you." I tried to move, to get away, but my body wouldn't respond. I felt something cool touch my arm and looked down to see roots, actual roots, growing from the creature's hand into my skin. "No," I gasped, trying to pull away. But I couldn't move. I could feel the roots spreading under my skin, a cold, creeping sensation. Suddenly there was a whoosh of heat, and the Timothy creature jerked back. Michael was there, holding a burning branch like a torch. "Get away from him!" he shouted, swinging. The branch at the creature. The thing that used to be Timothy hissed, a sound like steam escaping, and backed away from the fire. Michael helped me up. "Can you walk?" I nodded, though my legs felt weak. We started moving again, Michael keeping the burning branch between us and the forest creatures. As we climbed, I could feel something changing inside me. Where the roots had touched me, my skin felt strange, too tight and sort of see-through. "Michael," I said, my voice shaking, I think it's happening to me too." He looked at my arm, his face grim. "We need to get you out of here. Now!" We reached the top of the ridge again. Below us, the valley was an ocean of fire, but on the other side, I could see the normal forest, still dry from the drought, but not burning, not changed. "We're going to make it," Michael said. But as we started down the other side, we heard a sound behind us. A chorus of those strange, rustling voices. We turned to see them, dozens of forest creatures, standing at the top of the ridge. The Timothy creature was in front, its flower eyes fixed on us. "Wesley Harding," they said together. "The forest needs you. Stay, become." I felt a pull, like something was tugging at my insides. Part of me wanted to go to them, to join them, to become part of the forest. "Wes," Michael said sharply, "don't listen. That's not you. That's the forest talking." I shook my head, trying to clear it. "You're right, let's go!" We turned and ran down the slope towards the normal forest. Behind us, I heard a sound like 1,000 leaves rustling at once, a cry of frustration or loss. We didn't stop running until we reached the ranger station. By then, the sun was coming up. The fire in Blackwater Valley was still burning, but it seemed contained to that area. As soon as we burst into the station, everything became a blur of activity. There were questions, explanations, medical checks. I told them everything about the missing hikers, the hollow animals, the strange creatures in the forest. About Timothy. They didn't believe me at first. But then the fire crews came back with stories of their own, of seeing things in the smoke, things that couldn't be real. The official report called it a forest fire caused by the drought, with mass hallucinations brought on by smoke inhalation and stress. They said Timothy was still missing, presumed dead in the fire, but I knew the truth, and so did Michael. A week later, I was sitting in the hospital, still undergoing tests. The doctors couldn't explain the strange changes in my skin, where the roots had touched me. They said it would probably fade with time. Michael came to visit me. He looked tired but relieved. "The fire's out," he said. "They're saying it will take years for Blackwater Valley to recover." I nodded. Good. Maybe that will keep it contained. For a while, at least. Michael was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know it's not over, right? The forest is still there under the burnt parts, waiting, growing." I looked down at my arm, where I could still see the faint pattern of roots under my skin. "I know," I said quietly. "I can feel it." And I could. Even here, miles from the forest, I could feel it, calling to me, waiting for me to return, to become part of it. But I couldn't. I had seen what the forest could do, what it wanted to do, and as long as I was still human, still myself, I would resist. The forest would have to wait a little longer. 2 days later, I checked myself out of the hospital against the doctor's advice. The pattern on my arm hadn't faded. If anything, it had spread a little. But I couldn't just sit in a hospital bed while the forest was still out there. Chief Peterson was waiting for me at the ranger station, his face grim. "Harding," he said, nodding at me, "you look like hell." "Thanks, Chief," I replied. "Any news about Timothy?" Peterson shook his head. Search teams found no trace of him, or of the missing hikers. He paused, looking uncomfortable. "They did find some strange things, though. Animals that didn't look right, trees with weird markings." I nodded. "I told you what I saw." "I know, and I still think the smoke got to you." He sighed. "But there's someone here who wants to talk to you, says she's been studying the valley." He led me to the conference room. A woman was sitting at the table, surrounded by papers and samples in glass jars. She was small, with short black hair and glasses. When she looked up, I saw she had sharp, intelligent eyes. "Ranger Harding," she said, standing up. "I'm Dr. Elaine Nakamura. I've been hoping to speak with you." Peterson left us alone, and Dr. Nakamura got right to the point. "I've been studying the plant life in Olympic National Park for 5 years," she said. "Specifically, the fungal networks that connect the trees. And what I've found in Blackwater Valley is unprecedented." She showed me slides of plant cells that didn't look normal. They were changing, evolving in ways she couldn't explain. "The fungal network in that valley isn't just connecting the trees," she explained. "It's changing them, and not just the trees, everything that lives there, including people," I said quietly. She looked at me sharply. "Yes, including people." She pointed to my arm. "May I?" I rolled up my sleeve, showing her the root-like pattern spreading under my skin. She examined it without touching. Her face serious. "The fungus is trying to incorporate you," she said, "like it did with your friend Timothy." "Can you stop it?" I asked. She hesitated. "Maybe, but I need to understand it better first. I need to go to the valley." "It's too dangerous," I said. "The forest is alive, aware, and it's hungry. All the more reason to study it," she insisted. "If we don't understand it, we can't fight it." I knew she was right, but the thought of going back there made my skin crawl, literally. The pattern on my arm seemed to move at the mere mention of the valley. "Fine," I said finally, "but we do it my way, and we bring Michael Redfeather." Dr. Nakamura agreed, and we set out the next morning. The forest fire had burned itself out, contained to Blackwater Valley. As we drove toward it, I could see the blackened trees against the sky like skeletal fingers reaching up. Michael was waiting for us at the edge of the burn zone. He looked at Dr. Nakamura suspiciously. "You shouldn't be here," he told her. "None of us should." "I need to understand what's happening," she said firmly, "to stop it from spreading." Michael shook his head, but agreed to guide us. As we hiked into the burned valley, the smell of ash and smoke was overwhelming. Everything was black and grey. The trees reduced to charred stumps, but underneath the ash, I could see something green already growing, small plants pushing up through the blackened soil. "Too soon, too fast." "The fire should have killed everything," Dr. Nakamura said, kneeling to examine the new growth. "This isn't normal." "Nothing about this place is normal," Michael replied. We made our way to where the research station had been. It was gone now, collapsed into the caves below. But the entrance to the cave system was still there, a dark hole in the ground. Dr. Nakamura took samples of the new plants growing from the ashes, carefully placing them in sealed containers. She seemed fascinated rather than afraid, which worried me. As the day wore on, I started to feel strange. The pattern on my arm was spreading faster now, reaching my shoulder, and I could hear something. Not quite voices, but almost. Like the whispering we'd heard on the radio, but inside my head now. We should leave before dark, Michael said, looking at the setting sun with concern. But Dr. Nakamura wasn't ready to go. Just a few more samples, she insisted, moving deeper into the valley. That's when we heard it, that same moaning call we'd heard before. But this time, it came from all around us, as if the whole valley was calling out. We need to go, I said urgently. Now, too late. From the ashes around us, things began to rise. Not plants, not animals, but something in between. They had, vaguely, human shapes, but their bodies were made of twisted vines and roots, glowing with that same green light we'd seen before. And leading them was the Timothy creature, its flower eyes fixed on us. The forest lives, it said in that rustling voice. The forest grows, the forest needs. Dr. Nakamura stood frozen, her sample kit forgotten in her hands. Fascinating, she whispered. They're using the fungal network to maintain a collective consciousness. This isn't the time for scientific observations, I snapped, pulling her back. We turned to run, but we were surrounded. The forest creatures moved closer, reaching for us with branch-like fingers. What do they want? Dr. Nakamura asked, her scientific curiosity finally giving way to fear. Us, Michael said grimly. They want us. The Timothy creature stepped forward. Wesley Harding, it said, you are already changing. Join us willingly. Become part of the greater whole. I felt that pull again, stronger now. The pattern on my arm seemed to pulse in response to its words. No, I said, fighting the feeling. I won't. The creature tilted its head. Then we will take the woman instead. Before we could react, roots burst from the ground at Dr. Nakamura's, feet wrapping around her legs. She screamed as they began to burrow into her skin. I ran to her, trying to pull the roots away, but they were too strong. Michael was at my side, using his knife to cut at them. But for every root we severed, two more appeared. Help me! Dr. Nakamura cried, her voice filled with pain and fear. The forest creatures watched, those flower eyes unblinking. The Timothy creature spoke again. Join us willingly, Wesley Harding, and we will release her. Refuse, and she becomes part of us. I looked at Dr. Nakamura, at the roots already disappearing under her skin. At Michael, his face grim with the knowledge that we couldn't. Save her. At the burned valley around us, already growing back, hungrier than before. I made my decision. Let her go, I said to the Timothy creature, and I'll come with you. The creature seemed to consider this. Then, slowly, the roots retreated from Dr. Nakamura's legs, leaving her gasping on the ground. Wes, no, Michael said, grabbing my arm. You don't know what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing, I replied. I turned to Dr. Nakamura. Get out of here. Tell them what you've seen. Find a way to stop it. She nodded, her face pale. I will, I promise. As Michael helped her up, I turned back to the Timothy creature. I'm ready, I said, though every part of me was screaming to run. The creature reached out a hand. As it touched my arm, I felt those cold roots spreading under my skin again. But this time, I didn't fight it. I let it happen, and as the roots spread, I began to understand. I could feel the forest, all of it, every tree, every plant, every creature that had been changed. I could feel their thoughts, their hunger, their ancient patience. They had been here long before humans, and they would be here long after. They weren't evil. They were just surviving, adapting to a changing world. The drought had forced them to find new ways to grow, new vessels to use. But I could also feel something else, a weakness. The fire had hurt them more than they wanted to admit. And there was something about human consciousness they couldn't fully control, something that resisted. I focused on that resistance, holding on to my sense of self, even as the forest tried to absorb me. And I realized I didn't have to give in completely. I could be the bridge between human and forest. I could find a way to coexist, or I could destroy them from within. As these thoughts formed, I felt the Timothy creature pull back, suddenly wary. It could sense my intentions. "You resist," it said, its rustling voice now tinged with alarm. "This is not the way." "It's my way," I replied and lunged forward, grabbing it with both hands. The moment we connected fully, everything changed. I wasn't just feeling the forest, I was part of it, and it was part of me. I could see its history, its plans, its fears, and I knew what I had to do. Connected to the Timothy creature, I could see everything. The forest wasn't just plants, it was one giant living thing, spreading underground through roots and fungus. And it was old. So much older than I'd thought. It had been here before the first people came. It had watched them build homes and towns. It had learned from them, studied them. And when the droughts came, and it needed to survive, it found a new way to grow, through us. "Let them go," I said, still holding on to the Timothy creature. "They aren't part of this." The creature's flower eyes stared at me. "They are witnesses. They will bring others. They will burn us again." "I won't let that happen," I promised. "But you have to let them go." I could feel the forest considering this, thinking with its vast, strange mind. Finally, the Timothy creature nodded. "Go," it said to Michael and Dr. Nakamura. "The forest permits it." Michael looked at me, his face twisted with worry. "Wes, come with us." I shook my head. "I can't. Not yet. There's something I need to do." First, Dr. Nakamura stepped forward, her scientist's curiosity overcoming her fear. "What are you going to do?" "Find the heart," I said. "The center of all this. Maybe there's a way to communicate with it, to make it understand we can coexist. Or maybe you can kill it," Michael said quietly. The Timothy creature hissed at his words, but I held up a hand. "Go, now, before it changes its mind." They left, reluctantly, Michael looking back several times as they climbed out of the valley. When they were gone, I turned back to the Timothy creature. "Show me," I said. "Show me the heart." It led me to the cave entrance, the other forest creatures following. Behind, like a silent parade, as we descended into darkness, I could feel the roots under my skin spreading further, connecting me more deeply to the forest mind. The caves went deeper than I'd thought, twisting down into the earth. The walls were covered with a glowing fungus that lit our way. In some places, the rock itself seemed alive, pulsing like it had veins. "How many people have you taken?" I asked as we walked. "Many," the Timothy creature replied. "Over many years. They become part of us. Their memories live in the network." "Is Timothy still in there somewhere?" I asked. "The real Timothy?" The creature paused. "Parts of him, his memories, his knowledge, but he is forest now." We went deeper, the air getting warmer and damper. Finally, we reached a massive cavern, so big I couldn't see the other side. The ceiling was covered with those glowing fungi, lighting everything in a soft, green glow, and in the center was, I don't know how to describe it, a huge mass of roots and fungi and plant matter, pulsing with light like a giant heart. Smaller roots spread out from it in all directions, disappearing into the walls and ceiling. "The heart," the Timothy creature said, "the center of all." I approached it slowly. As I got closer, I could feel it more strongly in my mind. Ancient, patient, hungry. It had been growing for thousands of years, spreading through the forest. Above, connecting everything. "What do you want?" I asked it. "Why are you taking people?" The answer came not in words, but in feelings and images. Survival, adaptation. The drought had weakened it, made it desperate. Humans had knowledge, memories, ways of thinking that could help it survive. It wasn't evil, it was just trying to live, but there was something else too. A darker hunger. It didn't just want to survive, it wanted to spread. Beyond the valley, beyond the forest, it wanted everything. You can't have everything, I said. We won't let you. The heart pulsed angrily, and I felt pain shoot through my arm where the roots had spread. The Timothy creature stepped closer. You cannot stop us, it said. We are too old, too vast. We have waited too long. Maybe, I said. But I can try. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my lighter, the one thing I always carried, a reminder of my time in Vietnam. The forest creatures backed away, afraid of the small flame. Fire hurts you, I said. I could burn this place, burn the heart. The Timothy creature hissed. You would burn too. You are part of us now. It was right. The roots had spread too far under my skin. If I burned the heart, I would probably die, too. But before I could decide what to do, I heard something from one of the tunnels leading into the cavern. Voices. Human voices. Wes, are you down here? It was Michael and Dr. Nakamura. They hadn't left after all. The forest creatures turned toward the sound, their flower eyes glowing brighter with anger. The Timothy creature looked at me. You tricked us, it said. No, I replied. They made their own choice. Michael and Dr. Nakamura appeared at the entrance to the cavern, both carrying makeshift torches. When they saw the heart, they stopped in shock. My God, Dr. Nakamura whispered. It's incredible. The forest creatures moved toward them, but I stepped in the way. No, I said, they're under my protection. I could feel the heart considering this, its ancient mind working. Finally, it seemed to agree, and the creatures stopped. Dr. Nakamura approached cautiously, her scientific curiosity overwhelming her fear. This must be the central node of the fungal network, she said. The control center. It's more than that, I told her. It's alive, aware, and it's been here for thousands of years. Michael stayed back, his torch held high. Can you communicate with it? He asked. I nodded. Sort of. Not with words, but I can feel what it wants, what it fears. And what does it want? Dr. Nakamura asked. To grow, to spread. The drought weakened it, and it found a new way to survive, through us. As we talked, I noticed something moving in the shadows of the cavern. More forest creatures were emerging, dozens of them. Some looked almost human, others were barely recognizable. And among them, oh no, Dr. Nakamura gasped. Among the creatures were the missing hikers, or what was left of them. Their skin was transparent, their insides replaced with plants. They moved stiffly, like puppets, and at the front was a new creature, one that hadn't been there before. It looked like Dr. Nakamura, but its eyes were already changing, turning into those small white flowers. What is that? The real Dr. Nakamura, asked her voice shaking. It's you, I said quietly. Or what the forest thinks is you. It's making copies now. The fake Dr. Nakamura stepped forward, its movements jerky but getting smoother. The forest learns, it said in a voice that sounded almost like the real Nakamura's. The forest adapts. The real Dr. Nakamura backed away, bumping into Michael. We need to leave, she said, now. But the forest creatures were blocking the exits. We were trapped. I turned back to the heart, feeling its satisfaction. It had never intended to let them go. It had just been waiting, planning. You lied, I said to it. The response came in feelings again, not lies, just survival. It needed them, it needed me, it needed to grow. I looked at Michael and Dr. Nakamura, at the forest creatures closing in, at the heart pulsing in the center of the cavern. I made my decision. Run for the exit, I told them. I'll hold them off. We're not leaving you, Michael said. You have to. Someone needs to warn people about what's happening here. Dr. Nakamura looked from me to the heart, understanding in her eyes. You're going to burn it, I nodded. It's the only way. But the roots, she said, looking at my arm, they've spread too far. If you burn it... I know, I said. Now go. Michael hesitated, then handed me his torch. Good luck, Wes. They turned and ran for one of the tunnels. The forest creatures moved to follow, but I stepped in their way, torch held high. Your fight is with me now, I said. The Timothy creature approached, its flower eyes fixed on me. You cannot destroy us. We are too vast. Even if you burn the heart, parts of us will survive. Maybe, I said, but it'll buy us time. I moved toward the heart, torch in hand. The forest creatures followed, but kept their distance from the flame. Soon I reached the heart. I could feel it more strongly than ever, its fear, its anger, its desperate need to survive. And something else, too. The memories of all the people it had taken, including Timothy, they were still in there. Parts of them, at least. I'm sorry, Timothy, I whispered. I couldn't save you. But maybe I can stop this. I raised the torch, ready to set the heart ablaze. But before I could, the ground began to shake. Rocks fell from the ceiling, and the forest creatures scattered in panic. What's happening? I shouted. The Timothy creature looked up, its flower eyes wide. Fire, it said. Above, the forest burns again. I realized what was happening. The fire had reignited, or maybe someone had set a new one. Either way, the forest above was burning, and the caves were collapsing. A large section of the ceiling came down, crushing several forest creatures. The heart pulsed frantically, its light flickering. I had to make a choice. Stay and make sure the heart burned, or run and try to save myself. In the end, I didn't have to choose. A massive chunk of rock crashed down directly onto the heart, crushing part of it. The effect was immediate. All the forest creatures screamed at once, a sound like 1,000 trees falling. The Timothy creature collapsed, its light fading. All around the cavern, the other creatures were falling too. The heart was dying, but the cave was collapsing. I had to get out. I ran for the tunnel Michael and Dr. Nakamura had taken, dodging falling rocks. The roots under my skin burned with pain as the heart died, but I kept going. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning. My torch was fading and I could barely see, but I could feel fresh air ahead, pulling me forward. Finally, I saw light. Real light, not the green glow of the fungi. The exit was just ahead. I burst out of the cave into daylight, coughing and gasping. The forest was burning again, trees crackling and falling all around, but through the smoke I could see figures. Michael and Dr. Nakamura waiting for me. Wes, Michael called, running toward me. We thought you were dead. Not yet, I gasped, falling to my knees. The heart, it's crushed. The cave collapsed. Dr. Nakamura knelt beside me, looking at my arm. The root pattern was fading, the skin returning to normal. It's dying, she said. The network is breaking. Down. I nodded, too exhausted to speak. We had won, for now at least. The forest would burn, the heart was crushed, and the creatures were dying. But as Michael helped me up, I caught a glimpse of something in the burning trees. A tall, thin shape watching us. It wasn't Timothy, or any of the creatures we'd seen before. It was something older, something that had been there all along. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me despite the heat of the fire, that this wasn't over. The heart might be crushed, but the forest was vast. There would be other hearts, other networks. The forest would wait. The forest would grow again. The forest would remember. The next few days passed in a blur. The forest fire eventually burned itself out, contained to Blackwater Valley. The official report called it a natural disaster caused by the drought. No mention of hollow animals or plant creatures or ancient fungal networks. I spent 3 days in the hospital. The doctors couldn't explain the strange patterns on my skin, but they were fading slowly. Dr. Nakamura visited every day, taking samples and running tests. The fungus is dying, she told me on the 3rd day. Whatever was in that heart, crushing. It seems to have killed the network, at least for now. For now? I asked. She looked out the window toward the distant mountains where Blackwater Valley lay. Fungal networks are resilient. They can lie dormant for decades, waiting for the right conditions. Like another drought, I said. She nodded. We need to be ready next time. I've started a research team to study what we found. Chief Peterson didn't believe our story, of course. He wrote it off as smoke inhalation and stress. The missing hikers were listed as casualties of the fire. Timothy, too. No bodies were found, I reminded him. Fire that hot doesn't leave much, he replied, not meeting my eyes. I knew he was wrong, but I didn't argue. What would be the point? Who would believe the truth? Michael Redfeather disappeared after we escaped the valley. No one in the nearby towns had heard of him. Sometimes I wondered if he had been real at all, or just another part of the forest's strange magic. A month later, I was back at work. The pattern on my arm had faded to a pale scar, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. But sometimes, when I was alone in the forest, I could feel it tingling, like it was trying to wake up. Dr. Nakamura kept me updated on her research. She found traces of the same fungus in other parts of the park, dormant but alive, waiting. We need to be vigilant, she told me. If there's another drought, I nodded, understanding. We were the only ones who knew the truth, the only ones who could stop it if it happened again. One night, 6 months after Blackwater Valley, I woke. From a dream of roots and flowers and whispering trees, my arm was burning, the pattern glowing faintly in the dark. And I could hear something, not with my ears, but inside my head. A voice that sounded like rustling leaves. Wesley Harding, it said. The forest remembers. I got up and looked out my window. In the distance I could see the mountains where Blackwater Valley lay, dark against the night sky. For a moment, I thought I saw a green glow among the trees, pulsing like a heartbeat. The forest was waiting, and so was I. My name is Catherine Larson, but everyone calls me Kate. I've been a park ranger in the Boundary Waters for almost 4 years now. Before that, I flew helicopters in the army until a bad crash left me with a metal rod in my leg. It still hurts. When it gets really cold, and up here in Minnesota, it gets really, really cold. February 1987 has been the worst winter I can remember. The thermometer outside my cabin hit 30 below zero last night, and the wind makes it feel even colder. But there's something else making my skin crawl lately. Something that has nothing to do with the temperature. It started 3 days ago when Jack Donovan, one of our local hunting guides, came stumbling into the ranger station with wild eyes and shaking hands. The Millers are gone, he said, his breath coming out in white puffs. Just gone. The Millers were a family of 4 who had rented a remote cabin for ice fishing. Mom, Dad, and 2 kids around 10 and 12. Jack had been checking on them every few days, bringing supplies. What do you mean, gone? I asked, reaching for my radio. Everything's still there, food on the table, fire still warm in the stove. But they're just not there. And the tracks, Kate. His voice dropped to a whisper. The tracks outside aren't right. My boss assigned me to investigate, probably because I don't scare easy. Or maybe because my helicopter crash taught me that real monsters are just people who make bad choices. Either way, I packed my gear, rifle, first aid kit, emergency rations, and the voice recorder I used to document wildlife sightings. You should take Paul with you, my boss suggested, meaning Paul Whitehorse, our oldest ranger. He's Ojibwe knows these woods better than anyone, and was already getting ready to retire when I started. I work better alone, I said, but my boss shook his head. Not this time, Kate. Paul knows things about these woods that aren't in any training manual. That's how I found myself on a snowmobile with Paul riding behind me, heading across the frozen lake toward the Miller cabin as the sun began to set. The aurora borealis was dancing in the sky earlier than usual, green and purple lights that seemed to reach down toward the trees. Bad sign, Paul muttered behind me. What, the northern lights? Northern lights in blood moon season. Old stories say it means the veil is thin. I didn't ask what veil he meant. Paul was always talking about legends and spirits, and I had real people to find. We reached the cabin just as darkness fell. Jack was right. It looked like the family had just stepped out for a minute. Half-eaten breakfast sat on the table. The wood stove still had hot embers. 4 pairs of boots by the door, but the family's heavy winter coats were gone. They left in a hurry, I said, examining the door. No signs of a break-in. Paul was quiet, looking at something on the floor by the back door. When I came closer, I saw what had caught his attention. Muddy footprints, human footprints, led from the bedroom to the door, but they were smeared like someone had been dragged. "Look at this," Paul said, pointing to the father's desk where a journal lay open. The last entry was from 2 days ago. "Heard it again last night. The howling. It sounds like words now, like it's calling our names. Sarah says I'm imagining things, but the kids hear it too. Something watches us from the trees. I saw eyes reflecting in the darkness, too tall to be a wolf, too strange to be a man." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I turned to the window and froze. Outside, in the fresh snow, illuminated by our flashlights, was a line of tracks leading away from the cabin into the dark forest. They started as human footprints, but as they got farther from the cabin, they changed. The stride lengthened, the shape distorted. 20 yards from the cabin, they weren't human footprints anymore. They looked like wolf tracks, but huge, with marks that looked like thumbs. "Paul," I whispered, "what makes tracks like that?" His face had gone gray in the flashlight beam. "Something that shouldn't exist, Kate. Something that walks as both man and wolf." As if responding to his words, a howl rose from the dark forest, a sound that started like a wolf's cry, but twisted into something that made my blood freeze. Because mixed in with that animal sound were what seemed like words, human words. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those tracks changing from human to something else. Paul and I set up camp in the Miller cabin, taking turns keeping watch. Neither of us wanted to follow those tracks in the dark. Morning came with heavy gray clouds. The temperature had dropped even more, and my leg ached so bad I had to take 2 pain pills just to walk normal. "We should call for backup," I said, sipping coffee that wasn't nearly hot enough. Paul shook his head. "By the time they get here, the trail will be cold, and they won't believe what we're tracking anyway." I knew he was right. I barely believed it myself. We packed our gear and followed the strange tracks into the forest. The snow was deep, making each step hard work. The tracks led us deeper into the woods, away from any marked trails. "Look at this," Paul said, pointing to a tree. Deep claw marks ran up the trunk, higher than a bear could reach. "It's marking territory. Bears don't mark territory in winter. They hibernate," I said, but my voice didn't sound convincing even to me. "This isn't a bear, Kate." We walked for another hour before finding the first real clue about what happened to the Millers. Hanging from a tree branch about 15 feet up was a deer carcass. It was completely drained of blood, with no mess on the snow below. "What could lift a full deer that high?" I whispered. Paul just looked at me with those sad, knowing eyes. By midday, we found a small clearing where the snow was trampled down. In the middle lay a child's stuffed rabbit, the one I'd seen on the younger Miller kid's bed the night before. "They were here," I said, picking up the toy. It was still in good shape, not torn or bloody. "Maybe they're still alive." Paul knelt down, studying the ground. "Multiple tracks here. The family was herded." "Herded? Like by wolves?" "Not wolves. Wolves don't herd people 15 miles into the forest. Look at these prints." He pointed to a massive paw print with what looked like an opposable thumb. "That's not natural, Kate." I took out my camera and snapped pictures of the prints. No one would believe this without evidence. We followed the tracks to a rocky ridge overlooking a small frozen pond. The tracks seemed to vanish at the water's edge. They crossed the ice, Paul said. Smart. Harder to track that way. As we carefully crossed the pond, the sun began to set. We needed to find shelter soon. Winter nights in the boundary waters. Kill people fast. On the other side of the pond, we found an old trapper's cabin I'd never seen before. It wasn't on any of our maps. We should stay here tonight, Paul said. Not safe to be in the open after dark. The cabin door was unlocked. Inside was a single room with a small wood stove, a table, and a cot. Dust covered everything, but someone had been here recently. The ashes in the stove were still black, not grey with age. I found a metal box under the cot. Inside were old papers, yellowed with age. Military documents with classified stamped across them. Operation Moonwalker, dated 1952. Paul, look at this, I said, showing him a faded photograph of men in lab coats standing next to cages. The cages were big enough to hold people. Government's been in these woods before, Paul said quietly. Some things should stay buried. I flipped through more papers and stopped at a map. It showed the boundary waters with red X marks scattered throughout. One of the X marks was exactly where we were now. There's some kind of bunker marked here, I said, pointing to a spot about 2 miles north. Maybe that's where they took the family. As darkness fell, we heard the howling again, closer this time, much closer, and there was no mistaking it now. Mixed in with the animal sounds were words, human words. They're calling the family's names, Paul whispered. They're hunting them. I checked my rifle and made sure it was loaded. Then we need to find the Millers before those things do. The howls came again, from all around us now. We were surrounded, and then scratching at the door. Soft at first, then harder, like something with claws wanted in. The scratching at the door stopped suddenly. Paul and I looked at each other, not daring to breathe. Then came a soft whining sound, almost like a dog begging to be let in. Don't open it, Paul whispered. I nodded, gripping my rifle tighter. The whining changed, becoming more human-like. Then we heard a child's voice. Help us. Please let us in. My heart jumped. It sounded exactly like the miller's youngest kid. It's not them, Paul said, seeing my face. These things, they can copy voices. The voice called again, this time sounding like Mrs. Miller. Please, they're hunting us. Let us in. I moved toward the window, staying low. Carefully, I peeked out. In the moonlight, I could see shapes moving around the cabin. They walked on 2 legs, but moved wrong, like their joints bent in ways human joints shouldn't. We need to call for backup, I whispered, reaching for my radio. Static filled the small cabin when I turned it on. Through the noise, I heard broken words. Miller family, search team, tomorrow morning. They're sending help, I said, relief washing over me. If we live till morning, Paul replied. We took turns sleeping that night, keeping watch with the rifle ready. The scratching and voices continued for hours before finally stopping around 3 a.m. When morning came, the area around the cabin was covered in those strange tracks. They circled the building completely, like the creatures had been looking for. A way in. We should head for that bunker on the map, I said, checking my compass. It's our best chance of finding the Millers. Paul nodded, his face grim. And we need to move fast. Tonight is the blood moon. What's special about a blood moon? Old stories say it's when the veil between worlds is thinnest, when things that shouldn't exist can move freely. We packed quickly and headed north. The day was clear but bitterly cold. Every sound in the forest made me jump. Every shadow looked like it might be watching us. Around noon, we heard the sound of a helicopter. Looking up, I saw a black military chopper flying low over the trees. That's not Park Service, I said. Military, maybe. Government's always been interested in these woods, Paul replied, especially when strange things happen. The helicopter flew toward the same area we were heading. When it disappeared from view, we picked up our pace. An hour later, we found something that made my blood run cold. Hanging from trees in a small clearing were 3 deer carcasses, completely drained of blood. Below them, drawn in the snow with what looked like blood, was a strange symbol, a circle with a line through it. "What is that?" I asked. Paul's face had gone pale. "A warning. We're in their territory now." We kept moving, following a small stream that cut through the forest. The trees grew thicker here, blocking out much of the sunlight. The air felt heavy, like right before a storm. Then we heard voices, human voices. Up ahead, we crouched low and moved forward carefully. Through the trees, I could see a small clearing with what looked like a concrete bunker built into a hillside. 3 people stood outside, 2 men and a woman, all wearing heavy winter gear. One man had a military haircut and carried a rifle similar to mine. "Government agents," Paul whispered. "Or scientists," I added, noticing the equipment they were unloading from cases. We watched as they set up what looked like motion sensors around the bunker entrance. The woman was checking a thermal imaging camera. "We need to talk to them," I said. "They might know something about the Millers." Paul grabbed my arm. "Wait, look." The 3 people had stopped working and were staring into the forest on the far side of the clearing. They backed up slowly toward the bunker door. The woman raised her thermal camera. Then I saw what had spooked them. Moving through the trees was a large shape, walking on 2 legs, but definitely not human. It was too far away to see clearly, but I could make out that it was tall, maybe 7 feet, with a strange, hunched posture. One of the men raised his rifle, but the other pushed it down, shaking his head. They retreated into the bunker, closing the heavy metal door behind them. The shape in the trees disappeared. "What was that?" I whispered. "What we've been tracking," Paul said, "and now we know the government is tracking it too." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, we made our way toward the bunker. The motion sensors worried me, but we needed to talk to those people. We were about 50 yards away when we heard the howling again, this time from multiple directions. The blood moon was rising, glowing red through the trees. "Run!" Paul shouted. We sprinted for the bunker door. Behind us, crashing sounds came from the forest as something large moved through the trees. I pounded on the metal door. "Let us in. Park rangers." For a moment, nothing happened. Then we heard locks turning, and the door opened just enough for us to squeeze through before slamming shut behind us. Inside, the woman with the thermal camera pointed a pistol at us. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Ranger Catherine Larson," I said, trying to catch my breath. "This is Ranger Paul Whitehorse. We're looking for a missing family." The military-looking man stepped forward. "I'm Agent David Mercer. How did you find this place?" I pulled out the old map we'd found. "What's going on here? What are those things in the woods?" The third person, a thin man with glasses, looked nervously at Mercer. "They've seen them. We should tell them." Mercer glared at him, then sighed. "Fine, Dr. Morgan. Show them what we've recorded." Dr. Morgan led us to a bank of monitors, showing feeds from cameras placed around the forest. On one screen, caught in night vision, was a clear image of what had been hunting us. It stood on 2 legs like a man, but had the head and fur of a wolf. Its hands ended in long claws, and its eyes glowed in the camera light. "What is that?" I whispered. "We call them dogmen," Mercer said. "And tonight, during the blood moon, they'll be hunting." My head was spinning. Dogmen? It sounded crazy, but I'd seen the tracks, heard the howls, and now there it was on the screen in front of me. "What about the Miller family?" I asked, trying to focus on why we came here. Dr. Morgan, the woman with the thermal camera, looked uncomfortable. We think the dogmen took them." "Took them where? And why?" I pressed. Agent Mercer stepped in. "That's classified information, Ranger. You shouldn't even be here." Paul spoke up for the first time since we entered the bunker. "We have a right to know. This is our land, our people." Mercer and Dr. Morgan exchanged looks. The third man, who hadn't introduced himself yet, nodded slightly. Mercer sighed. Fine, but this doesn't leave this room. Understood? We nodded. The government has known about the dogmen since the 1950s, Mercer began. They were part of a secret program called Operation Moonwalker. The goal was to create super soldiers who could transform at will. Like werewolves? I asked, feeling silly even as I said it. Exactly like werewolves, Dr. Morgan confirmed, but something went wrong. The test subjects couldn't control the transformations. They escaped into these woods. The unnamed man spoke up. We've been monitoring them ever since, trying to contain the situation. And the Millers? I asked. Dr. Morgan looked sad. We think the dogmen are recruiting, trying to increase their numbers. A chill ran down my spine. You mean they're turning people into more dogmen? Mercer nodded grimly. That's our theory. And with the blood moon tonight, they'll be at their strongest. Suddenly, alarms started blaring. Red lights flashed on the control panel. They've breached the outer perimeter, the unnamed man shouted, pointing to one of the screens. On the monitor, we could see several dogmen moving through the trees towards the bunker. They moved fast, sometimes on two legs, sometimes on all fours. We need to evacuate, Mercer said, grabbing a large black duffel bag. There's a helicopter coming for extraction in 20 minutes. What about the Millers? I demanded. We can't just leave them. There's nothing we can do for them now, Mercer replied coldly. I looked at Paul. He nodded slightly, understanding what I was thinking. We're staying, I said firmly. This is our job. We find missing people. Mercer looked like he wanted to argue, but another alarm cut him off. They're at the door, Dr. Morgan yelled. We could hear scratching and pounding on the metal bunker door. It was built to withstand a lot, but I wasn't sure how long it would hold against these creatures. Fine, Mercer snapped. Stay if you want, but don't expect us to come back for you. He turned to his team. Let's move to the helipad. As Mercer and his team gathered their gear, Paul and I checked our own equipment. We didn't have much, just my rifle, some flares, and our survival packs. Dr. Morgan hesitated before following Mercer. She handed me a small device. It's a thermal imager. It might help you track them. And the Millers. I nodded thanks as she hurried after the others. Paul and I were left alone in the control room. The pounding on the door was getting louder. Any ideas? I asked him. Paul studied the monitors. Look there, he said, pointing to a screen showing the back of the bunker. There's a small exit, emergency escape hatch probably. I saw it. A narrow door, partially hidden by bushes. No dogmen were visible in that area. If we can get out that way, maybe we can circle around, try to pick up the Miller's trail, I suggested. Paul nodded. It's risky, but it's our best shot. We made our way to the back of the bunker. The emergency exit was there, just like on the screen. I could hear the helicopter starting up somewhere above us. As I reached for the door handle, a howl split the air. Closer than ever before. My hand shook as I turned the handle. Ready? I whispered to Paul. He nodded, his face grim in the red glow of the emergency lights. I took a deep breath and opened the door. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of pine and something else, something wild and dangerous. We stepped out into the snowy night. The blood moon hung low and huge in the sky, casting everything in an eerie red light. Somewhere in the darkness, a twig snapped. We froze, listening hard. Another snap, closer this time. Run, Paul whispered. We took off into the woods. The sounds of pursuit right behind us. We ran through the forest, snow crunching under our boots. The blood moon lit our way with its strange red glow. I could hear something following us, not right behind, but circling, tracking. They're herding us, Paul gasped. As we stopped behind a large fallen tree to catch our breath, I pulled out the thermal imager Dr. Morgan had given me. Through its screen, I could see heat signatures moving through the trees, at least 3 of them, circling around us. There, I whispered, pointing to our left. And there, Paul nodded. They're smart, hunting like a pack. I checked. My rifle. 6 bullets left. Not enough if those things decided to attack all at once. What do they want? I asked, my breath making white clouds in the freezing air. To change us, Paul said simply. The blood moon gives them power, makes them able to turn others. A howl rose from the forest, answered by another, then another. They were calling to each other. We need to keep moving, I said. Find the Millers before these things do whatever they're planning. We moved carefully through the trees, using the thermal imager to avoid the dogmen. It was like a deadly game of hide and seek. Twice we had to freeze and hold our breath as one of the creatures passed nearby, so close I could hear it breathing. After what felt like hours, we came to a small clearing. In the center stood a circle of stones, old and covered with moss. The snow inside the circle had melted, leaving bare ground. What is this place? I whispered. Paul's face was grim in the moonlight. Sacred ground, very old. The Ojibwe people knew about the dogmen long before the government did. As we approached the stone circle, I noticed something strange. The howling had stopped. The forest was completely silent. They won't come here, Paul said. This place is protected. I wasn't sure if I believed in such things, but I was grateful for the moment of safety. We sat on the stones, checking our map by the red moonlight. The Miller cabin is here, I said, pointing. We found tracks leading this way, then to the trapper's cabin, and now we're here. But where would they take the family? Paul studied the map. There, he said, pointing to a spot about a mile north. There's an old mine shaft there. Perfect place to hide. As we were planning our next move, I heard something that made my blood freeze. A child crying. We both looked up. At the edge of the clearing stood a small figure. Even in the dim light, I could tell it was the miller's youngest child. Hello, I called softly, standing up. Are you okay? The child didn't answer, but turned and walked back into the trees. Wait! I started to follow, but Paul grabbed my arm. Be careful, he warned. It might be a trick. I nodded, but I couldn't ignore a child in danger. We followed cautiously, keeping the small figure in sight as it moved through the trees. The child led us to a steep hillside. There, half hidden by bushes, was the entrance to an old mine shaft, just as Paul had guessed. The child disappeared. Inside, we paused at the entrance, listening. From deep inside came voices, human voices. The Millers, I whispered hopefully. Paul didn't look convinced. Maybe, or maybe something else. I turned on my flashlight and shined it into the mine shaft. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a tunnel that sloped downward into the earth. We have to check, I said, stepping forward. The tunnel was cold and damp. Water dripped from the ceiling, and our footsteps echoed on the stone floor. The voices grew louder as we moved deeper. After about 50 yards, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. My flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing a shocking sight. The Miller family was there, all 4 of them, but they were changed. Their skin was pale, their eyes reflecting the light like animals. They were chained to the wall, but the chains seemed almost unnecessary. They weren't trying to escape. Mrs. Miller, I said, approaching slowly. Mr. Miller, we're here to help. You, Mrs. Miller looked up at me, her eyes not quite human anymore. You shouldn't have come, she whispered. They'll change you too. Who? The dogmen, I asked. She nodded weakly. They bit us during the last moon, said we'd become like them during this one. I looked at Paul, horror washing over me. They're turning them into more dogmen. Before Paul could answer, a low growl came from the tunnel behind us. We spun around to see a massive shape blocking the exit. It was a dogman, bigger than the others we'd seen, with silver-grey fur and eyes that glowed yellow in the darkness. It stood fully upright, nearly 8 feet tall. You are trespassing, it said, the words coming out rough and distorted, but clearly understandable. I raised my rifle with shaking hands. Let these people go." The creature tilted its head, almost curiously. "They are not people anymore. They are becoming like us." "Why are you doing this?" I demanded. "Survival," it growled. "We were made by your kind, experiments, mistakes. Now we make more of us, to survive." As it spoke, more dogmen appeared behind it, filling the tunnel. We were trapped. The largest one, clearly the leader, stepped forward. "You have two choices. Join us willingly, or we make you join." I looked at the Miller family, their transformation already beginning. Then at Paul, who stood ready to fight despite the impossible odds. The blood moon's light filtered down through a crack in the ceiling, bathing everything in red, and I realized we were running out of time. My mind raced. We were trapped in this mine with the dogmen blocking our only way out. The Millers were chained up, halfway to becoming monsters themselves, and now we had to choose, become like them, or I didn't want to think about the or. "We're not joining you," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. My rifle was pointed at the leader, but I knew it wouldn't do much good against so many of them. Paul stepped forward. "Wait," he said calmly. "Let's talk about this." The leader dogman tilted its head, curious. "Talk? Humans don't talk to us. They hunt us." "We're not hunters," Paul said. "We're here to help, to understand." I looked at Paul, confused. What was he doing? "You were human once," Paul continued. "Part of you still is. You don't have to do this." The leader growled, but it sounded almost sad. "We have no choice. The change, it hurts, it drives us. We need to make more or we'll die out." "The government did this to you," I said, suddenly understanding. "The experiments, Operation Moonwalker." The dogman nodded. "They made us, then abandoned us, left us to suffer." I lowered my rifle slowly. "Maybe we can help, find a cure," the leader snarled. "No cure, only survival." Just then, we heard a noise from above, the whir of helicopter blades. The dogmen looked up, alarmed. The leader barked something in a language I didn't understand, and several of them ran back up. "The tunnel. What's happening?" I asked. "Government," the leader growled. "They come to clean up their mess." Suddenly the mine shook with an explosion. Dust and small rocks fell from the ceiling. "They're collapsing the mine," I shouted. "We need to get out of here." The dogmen were panicking now, running in all directions. In the chaos, I ran to the Millers and started working on their chains. "Paul, help me," I called. But when I looked up, Paul wasn't there. Instead, I saw him talking urgently with the dogman leader. Another explosion rocked the mine. Bigger rocks were falling now. "Paul!" I screamed. "We have to go!" He turned to me, his face sad but determined. "Get them out, Kate. I'll hold them off." "What?" "No." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Paul smiled grimly. "It's the only way. Go. Now." Before I could argue, he turned back to the leader. They clasped hands, human and monster, and then ran deeper into the mine, away from the collapsing entrance. I didn't have time to think about what just happened. I focused on freeing the Millers. They were weak and confused, but able to walk. "Come on," I said, leading them towards the exit. "We have to hurry." We stumbled through the falling rocks and dust. I could hear shouting and gunfire from above. Just as we reached the entrance, a final explosion brought down the tunnel behind us. We burst out into the cold night air, coughing and gasping. Government agents in black gear surrounded us immediately, guns pointed. "Stand down," a familiar voice shouted. Agent Mercer pushed through the crowd. "These are survivors. Get them to the medical tent." As the Millers were led away, Mercer turned to me. "Where's the other ranger?" I looked back at the collapsed mine entrance, my heart heavy. He didn't make it." Mercer's face hardened. "Did you see them? The creatures?" I thought about Paul, about the leader's sad eyes, about the truth behind their existence. "No," I lied. "We didn't see anything." Mercer studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Get yourself checked out. We'll need a full report." As I walked away, I heard him ordering his team to set up explosives around the entire hill. They were going to bury everything. In the medical tent, doctors looked over the Millers and me. The family was in shock, unable to speak about what happened. The doctors said the infection hadn't spread too far. They might be okay. I sat on a cot, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun rise over the trees. The blood moon was gone. In the daylight, it all seemed like a bad dream. But I knew it wasn't. I knew the truth now, about the government's secret. Experiments about the creatures they'd created and abandoned, about Paul's sacrifice, and I knew that somewhere, deep under the ground, the dogmen were still there, waiting, surviving. As Mercer had said, they were cleaning up their mess. But some messes can't ever be truly cleaned up. Some secrets don't stay buried. I touched the thermal imager in my pocket. I had evidence. I had the truth. The question was, what was I going to do with it? The next morning, the whole area was crawling, with government agents. They set up a command center with tents and equipment. Helicopters flew overhead, scanning the forest. I sat in a folding chair, wrapped in a blanket, watching them work. My leg ached worse than ever. One of the doctors had given me some pills, but they barely helped. Agent Mercer approached, looking tired. "We need your statement, Ranger Larson." I nodded, too exhausted to argue. He led me to a tent with recording equipment. "Start from the beginning," he said. "When you first heard about the missing family." I told him most of the truth, about finding the cabin empty, following the tracks, discovering the old documents. But I left out what Paul had told me about the dogmen, and I didn't mention that they could talk. "And Ranger Whitehorse?" Mercer asked. "You said he didn't make it out of the mine?" I looked down at my hands. There was a cave-in. He pushed me and the Millers out first. Mercer studied me. "You're holding something back." Before I could answer, a young agent burst into the tent. "Sir, we've got movement at the north perimeter." Mercer jumped up. "Stay here," he ordered me, then rushed out. Of course, I didn't stay. As soon as he was gone, I followed. Outside, agents were running toward the northern edge of the camp, weapons ready. I grabbed my rifle from where they'd left it and limped after them. At the edge of the clearing, agents had formed a line, guns pointed at the trees. Mercer stood in front, a megaphone in his hand. "This is a restricted area," he shouted. "Come! Out with your hands up." For a moment nothing happened. Then slowly a figure emerged from the trees. It was Paul. His clothes were torn and dirty. Blood stained his jacket, but he was alive. "Hold your fire," I shouted, pushing through the line of agents. Paul walked slowly toward us, hands raised. Behind him came more figures. The missing researchers from Operation Moonwalker. They looked normal human, but I knew what they really were. "What is this?" Mercer demanded. Paul stopped a few yards away. "We want to talk," he said calmly. "No more hiding. No more fighting." Mercer looked suspicious. "Who are these people?" "The original test subjects," Paul said, "from Operation Moonwalker. They've been living in these woods for decades." I moved to stand beside Paul. "They deserve to be heard, Agent Mercer." Mercer hesitated, then lowered his gun. "Fine, let's talk." In the command tent, Paul explained everything. How the dogmen were once human, how they'd learned to control their transformations, how they only wanted to be left alone. "The Millers stumbled into their territory," Paul said. "They were trying to protect themselves by turning them into monsters," Mercer asked. "They were desperate," I said, "afraid of being wiped out. They thought making more like them was the only way to survive." One of the researchers, an old man with sad eyes, spoke up. "We've lived with this curse for 70 years. We never asked. You for it. Your government did this to us." Mercer looked uncomfortable. "That was a different time, different people. But the same government," I said. "You owe them." "What do you want?" Mercer finally asked. "Protection," Paul said. "This land declared off limits, and medical help for those who want to try to reverse the change." Mercer laughed bitterly. "You think I can just make that happen?" "I think you can try," I said. "Or I can take everything I know to the press. The thermal images, the documents, everything. The tent went quiet. Mercer stared at me, then at Paul, then at the researchers. "I'll need to make some calls," he said finally. As Mercer left the tent, Paul turned to me. "Thank you." "For what?" "For believing, for helping." I smiled tiredly. What choice did I have? They're people. Just, different now. That evening, as the sun set, Mercer returned with news. His superiors had agreed to Paul's terms, for now. The area would be declared a wildlife preserve, closed to the public. A small medical team would stay to work with those who wanted help. "It's not perfect," Mercer admitted, "but it's a start." I watched from the edge of camp as Paul led the researchers back into the forest. He turned once to wave. At me. "You're not going with them?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not yet. I need to be the bridge between their world and ours, someone who understands both sides." I nodded, understanding. "Will I see you again?" "Count on it," he said with a smile. As darkness fell, I heard a howl from deep in the forest. But this time, it didn't fill me with fear. It sounded almost peaceful. I knew the truth now, about the government's mistakes, about the creatures they'd created, about the thin line between human and monster. And I knew that sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones with fangs and claws. Sometimes they're the ones who play with nature and abandon the consequences. As I packed up to leave the next morning, I looked out at the forest one last time. Somewhere out there, the dogmen were living their lives, trying to find peace with what they'd become, and somewhere out there, Paul was helping them. I touched the thermal imager in my pocket. I'd keep it just in case. Some secrets deserve to be protected, and some truths are too dangerous to share. But if the government ever broke its promise, I'd be ready to tell the world about what really happened under the blood moon in the boundary waters. My name is Marcus Callahan, and I've been a forest ranger at Shawnee National Forest for almost 15 years now. The trees and we've got a special kind of friendship. They don't ask questions about my past, and I make sure nobody hurts them. It's a good deal for both of us. I still remember the first time I saw something strange in my forest. It was a Tuesday morning in late October. The air was crisp, and the leaves were showing off their best reds and golds. I was doing my usual patrol when I found a deer carcass that didn't look right. Now, I've seen plenty of dead animals in my time. That's just nature doing its thing. But this one was different. The deer had been cut open with something sharp, and parts of it were missing. Not like when a mountain lion or coyote makes a kill. This was neater, more careful. Probably just some weird hunter, I told myself, kicking at the fallen leaves. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I couldn't sleep. My little cabin at the edge of the forest felt colder than usual. The wind whispered through the trees outside my window, and for the first time in years, the sound didn't comfort me. The next morning, I found 2 more deer in the same condition. And this time, I noticed something else. Strange footprints in the mud nearby. They looked almost human, but not quite. The toes were too long, spread wide like fingers. I took pictures with my phone and tried to make a plaster cast, but it started raining before I could finish. I didn't tell anyone about what I found. Who would believe me anyway? The new park director already thought I was a bit odd. The quiet, lonely ranger who preferred trees to people. If I started talking about weird footprints and mysteriously cut-up animals, I'd be out of a job faster than you can say psychiatric evaluation. So I kept it to myself and started carrying my dad's old hunting knife along with my usual gear, just in case. For a few weeks things were quiet. I almost convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. Then the hikers started reporting strange noises at night, scratching sounds outside their tents, whispers that didn't sound quite human. Probably just raccoons, I told them with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. They can be real pests when they smell food, but I knew it wasn't raccoons. Something was watching us in the forest. Something that didn't want to be seen, and I was going to find out what it was, even if it killed me. I started keeping a journal of all the weird things happening in my forest. Not that I'd ever show it to anyone, but writing stuff down helped me make sense of it all. The first week of November brought heavy rain and thick fog that hung between the trees like ghostly curtains. Perfect weather for whatever was out there to hide even better. I doubled my patrols, staying out later than I should have. That's when I met Sarah Chen, the new biologist sent by the university to study our local wildlife. She was setting up trail cameras when I found her, soaked to the bone but still smiling. "You must be Ranger Callahan," she said, pushing wet hair from her face. "The office said I might run into you out here." I nodded, suddenly aware of how long it had been since I'd had a real conversation with someone. "Call me Marcus. Need any help with those cameras?" Over the next few days, Sarah and I set up 12 cameras throughout the forest. I didn't tell her what I was really hoping to catch on film. I just said we'd been having problems with poachers. "You seem tense," she said one afternoon as we hiked back to the ranger station. "Everything okay?" I almost told her then. About the footprints, the mutilated animals, the feeling of being watched. But I just shrugged instead. "Just tired. Haven't been sleeping well." That night, something scratched at my cabin door. Not like an animal looking for food, more like fingers dragging slowly across the wood. When I grabbed my flashlight and yanked the door open, nothing was there. But in the mud of my front step was another one of those strange footprints. The next morning, I checked Sarah's first batch of trail camera photos. Most showed the usual: deer, raccoons, a couple of coyotes. But the last one made my blood run cold. It was taken at 3:17 a.m. The image showed something tall standing between two trees. The fog made it hard to see clearly, but it wasn't human. The arms were too long, hanging almost to the ground, and its head wasn't right. I deleted the photo before Sarah could see it. I told myself I was protecting her, but really, I was scared of what she'd think if I showed it to her. 2 days later, I met old Tom, a logger who'd worked these woods longer than I'd been alive. I found him sitting on a stump, staring into the trees with eyes that had seen too much. "They're getting bolder," he said without looking at me. "Who is?" I asked, though I already knew. "The forest folk, the watchers. They've been here longer than us, you know. My grandpa used to tell stories." I sat down next to him. "What kind of stories?" Tom's weathered face crinkled. "People go missing in these woods. Always have. Most folks blame it on getting lost or animal attacks. But my grandpa knew better. He said they take people sometimes. Study them like we study bugs." A cold feeling spread through my chest. "Have you seen them?" Tom nodded slowly. "Once, back in '82, they took my buddy Mike. I saw them drag him away. Nobody believed me, said I was drunk or crazy. Maybe I was, but I know what I saw. That night I couldn't sleep again. Every sound made me jump. The wind in the trees, branches scraping against my roof, the old cabin settling. Around midnight I heard what sounded like whispering outside my window. Grabbed my flashlight and gun and went to look. The beam of light cut through the darkness, landing on the edge of the trees. For a second, I thought I saw eyes reflecting back at me. Not two eyes, but many, at different heights. Then they were gone. The next day, 3 loggers went missing. From a site 2 miles from my cabin, the search party found their equipment abandoned, chainsaws still running. No blood, no signs of a struggle, just empty woods and silence. I knew then that whatever was out there was done hiding. It was ready to be seen, and I was starting to think it wanted to see me too. The search for the missing loggers went on for 3 days. Police, volunteers, search dogs, they all combed through the forest but found nothing. No bodies, no blood, not even a scrap of clothing. It was like those three men had just vanished into thin air. I knew better, and so did old Tom. They took. In them, he whispered to me when no one else was listening, just like they took Mike all those years ago. I nodded, feeling sick to my stomach. We need to tell someone. Tom laughed, but there was no humor in it. Who'd believe us? You want to end up in the crazy house? He was right. Without proof, we'd sound like lunatics. So I kept quiet and watched as the search was called off after a week. Probably got lost and died of exposure, the sheriff said. Bodies might turn up in spring, but I couldn't let it go. Those men had families waiting for them. They deserved answers. The next morning, I went back to the loggers' site alone. The chainsaws were gone now, taken as evidence, but I could still see where they'd been dropped. I walked in circles, looking for anything the search teams might have missed. That's when I noticed it. A small path leading deeper into the woods. Not a human trail. The bushes were pushed aside in a way that looked wrong, like something had dragged itself through. I followed the path for almost a mile. It led to a small clearing I'd never seen before, even though I thought I knew every inch of this forest. In the middle of the clearing was a cave entrance, half hidden by fallen rocks. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I should go back, I thought, get help. But who would come? Who would believe me? I turned on my flashlight and stepped into the cave. The smell hit me first, damp earth and something else, something sour and strange. The cave tunnel sloped downward, deeper than I expected. My light bounced off wet walls as I crept forward, trying not to make a sound. After about 50 feet, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and that's where I found him, the fourth logger, the one no one knew was missing. His name was Pete Wilson. I recognized him from town. He was huddled against the wall, shaking. His clothes were torn and dirty, and his eyes were wide with terror. "Pete," I whispered, moving toward him slowly. "Pete, it's Ranger Callahan. I'm here to help you." He flinched away from my light. "Turn it off," he hissed. "They don't like the light. They'll come back." I clicked off the flashlight and moved closer, guided by the dim light filtering in from the tunnel. "Who will come back, Pete? What happened to the others?" "They took them," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Deeper, down below. I got away. I hid. But they're looking for me." I put my hand on his shoulder, feeling him tremble. "Who, Pete? Who took them?" He looked up at me, his face pale in the darkness. "The people who live under the forest. They've been here all along, watching us, studying us." He grabbed my arm suddenly, his fingers digging in. "They're not like us, Ranger. They look almost human, but they're not. Their eyes, their hands." A sound echoed from deeper in the cave, a soft scraping like nails on stone. Pete whimpered. "They're coming back," he whispered. "We have to go, now." I helped him to his feet, and we stumbled back through the tunnel as fast as we could. Pete was weak, barely able to walk, so I half-carried him. The whole time, I could hear those scraping sounds following us, getting closer. We burst out of the cave into the daylight. Pete fell to his knees, gasping for air. I turned back toward the cave entrance, drawing my gun, but nothing emerged from the darkness. "They won't come out in the light," Pete said. "Not yet, anyway." I got Pete back to my truck and drove him straight to the hospital in town. On the way, he told me more about what had happened, how the creatures had surrounded them in the woods, moving so fast they were just blurs, how they'd dragged the men underground through a network of tunnels, how Pete had managed to slip away when the creatures were distracted by something. "What did they want?" I asked him. Pete stared out the window at the passing trees. "To learn about us. They had tools. They were taking samples." His voice broke. "The others, they were still alive when I left. I could hear them screaming at the hospital. The doctors took Pete away. I tried to tell the sheriff what Pete had told me, but he just shook his head. "Man's been through a trauma," he said. "Probably got lost, hit his head. The mind makes up stories to explain things it can't understand." But I understood, and I knew what I had to do. That night I loaded my rifle, packed extra ammunition, food, water, and my first aid kit. I was going back to that cave. I was going to find those missing loggers, or what was left of them, and I was going to find out exactly what was living under my forest. I didn't go alone. I couldn't. As much as I wanted to keep Sarah out of this, I knew I needed backup. When I told her what was happening, I expected her to laugh or call me crazy. Instead, she just nodded and said, "I felt it too, something watching in the woods." Left at dawn, our backpacks heavy with supplies. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. It was like the whole woods was holding its breath. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked as we neared the clearing with the cave. I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. "We need answers." The cave entrance looked darker than before, like a mouth waiting to swallow us. I switched on my flashlight, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. Sarah followed close behind. The tunnel seemed longer this time, twisting deeper into the earth. Our lights made strange shadows dance on the walls. Every sound echoed, our footsteps, our breathing, the drip of water somewhere in the darkness. We reached the chamber where I'd found Pete. It was empty now, but something caught my eye. Scratches on the wall, not random, but in patterns, almost like writing. "Marcus," Sarah whispered, her voice shaky. "Look." She was pointing at the far side of the chamber. There was another tunnel there, one I hadn't noticed before. And on. The ground in front of it was a logger's hard hat, cracked and stained with something dark. We both knew we should turn back, but we didn't. We kept going, following the new tunnel as it sloped down, down, down. The air got colder, damper. That strange sour smell from before got stronger. And then we started hearing things, soft scraping sounds, like what I'd heard when rescuing Pete. But also whispers, words, just on the edge of understanding, in voices that didn't sound quite human. "We're not alone down here," I said, my hand tightening on my rifle. Sarah nodded, her face pale in the flashlight beam. "They know we're here." We pressed on, the tunnel widening into a vast underground cavern. Our lights couldn't reach the ceiling or the far walls, but they did show us something else, structures, buildings almost, but not like any I'd ever seen. They were made of some kind of smooth, dark material with odd angles and curves. "It's a city," Sarah breathed, "an underground city." That's when we saw them, figures moving in the shadows, tall and thin. Their skin was pale, almost glowing in a light. Their arms were too long, their fingers too many, and their faces, I'll never forget their faces. Almost human, but wrong. Eyes too big, mouths too wide. They moved fast, darting between the structures, always just out of clear view. "We need to go," I said, grabbing Sarah's arm. "Now!" But as we turned to leave, we found our way blocked. 3 of the creatures stood there, watching us with those huge dark eyes. They didn't attack, they just studied us. Like we were bugs under a microscope. One of them stepped forward. Its mouth opened and sounds came out, clicks and whistles mixed with broken English. "Why, you here?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're looking for our friends, the men you took." The creature tilted its head, bird-like. "Friends, safe, learning, you learn too." A chill ran down my spine. I remembered what Pete had said about samples and screaming. "No," I said firmly, "we want our friends back, all of them, now." The creatures looked at each other, making those clicking sounds again. Then the one in front turned back to us. "You stay. Or friends, stay." It was a trade. Us for the loggers. I looked at Sarah, saw the fear in her eyes, but also determination. We both knew what we had to do. "Okay," I said, "we'll stay, but you let our friends go." The creature made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Good. Much to learn." As it reached for us with those long, many-fingered hands, I realized we might have made a terrible mistake. But it was too late to take it back now. We were about to find out exactly what these creatures wanted to learn about humans. And something told me we weren't going to like the lesson. They didn't hurt us. Not exactly. They took our flashlights and my rifle, then led us deeper into their underground city. I kept Sarah close, our shoulders touching as we walked. It gave us both a little courage. The creatures moved around us like shadows, their feet making soft padding sounds on the stone. Floor! I counted at least 12 of them now, all watching us with those big, dark eyes. "What do you think they want?" Sarah whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know. But stay alert. First chance we get, we grab the loggers and run." The city was bigger than I first thought. Tunnels branched off in all directions, and strange glowing moss on the walls gave everything an eerie blue-green light. The buildings weren't made of stone like I'd guessed, but some kind of hardened clay or mud shaped into smooth domes and arches. Our guide stopped at one of the larger structures and motioned for us to enter. Inside was a round room with a dirt floor, and there, huddled against the far wall, were the 3 missing loggers. They looked awful, dirty, thin, with dark circles under their eyes. But they were alive. When they saw us, one of them, a big guy named Mike, struggled to his feet. "Ranger?" He croaked. "What are you doing here?" "We came to get you out," I said, moving toward them. But the creatures blocked my path, making those clicking sounds again. The one who had spoken to us earlier stepped forward. "Exchange," it said in that broken English. "You, for them." Mike's eyes widened. "No, Ranger. You don't know what they do. The tests." "Tests?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking a little. Another logger, Tim, pulled up his sleeve. His arm was covered in small, precise cuts and what looked like needle marks. "They're studying us. Our blood, our skin. They ask questions. Make us solve puzzles if we get it wrong." He trailed off, shuddering. The creature clicked impatiently. "Time! Now! You stay. They go." I looked at Sarah, saw the fear in her eyes, but also something else. Curiosity. The scientist in her wanted to understand these beings, even as the human in her was terrified. "We'll stay," I said firmly, "but I want to talk to whoever's in charge first. Your leader." The creature stared at me for a long moment, then made a sound like a sigh. "Follow." It led us through more tunnels, deeper into the earth. The air got warmer and that strange smell stronger. Finally, we entered a massive cavern, bigger than any I'd seen before. In the center was a pool of water that glowed with the same blue-green light as the moss, and beside the pool stood a creature larger than the others. Its skin was darker, marked with patterns that might have been tattoos or natural coloring. When it turned to look at us, I saw intelligence in those huge eyes, and something else, worry. "Elder," it said, its English better than the others. "Why, you come here?" I stepped forward, trying to look braver than I felt. "Your people took our friends. We want them back." The elder tilted its head. "Need to understand. Humans, changing forest, cutting trees, poisoning water, our home dying." Sarah moved up beside me. "You've been watching us, studying us?" "Many years," the elder nodded. "Humans, dangerous, but also interesting. Want to know why you destroy?" I thought about the loggers, the cuts and needle marks. "So you take people, hurt them?" The elder made a gesture with its long fingers. "Not hurt. Learn. Need to know. Enemy." "We're not your enemy," Sarah said. "Not all of us anyway. Some of us want to protect the forest too." The elder stared at her for a long time. Then it turned and dipped its hand in the glowing pool. The water rippled and images appeared on its surface, pictures of clear-cut forests, polluted rivers, dead animals, things these creatures had seen over the years. "This, what humans do," the elder said. our home, your playground. I felt shame wash over me. It wasn't wrong. Humans had done all those things and worse. Some humans are bad, I admitted. But kidnapping people isn't the answer. It just makes things worse. Makes us afraid of you. The elder considered this. What better way? Sarah stepped forward. Let us help you. I'm a scientist. I study the forest too. Maybe we can work together to protect it. The elder's eyes narrowed. Trust humans? Not all of us, I said. But some. Start small. Let our friends go. Then Sarah and I will come back. We'll talk more. For a long moment the elder was silent. The other creatures watched, waiting. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Finally the elder nodded. Go, all, but return 3 days, alone. I couldn't believe it was that easy. You'll let us all leave just like that? The elder made that sighing sound again. War, with humans. We lose. Need new way. As we turned to go, the elder spoke once more. Remember, Ranger, we always watching. I believed it. And as we led the exhausted loggers back through the tunnels toward daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just changed something important. The balance between their world and ours had shifted, and I wasn't sure if that was good or bad. The sun was setting by the time we made it back to the surface. The loggers were weak, barely able to walk, but they were alive. We got them to the hospital, where doctors looked them over and asked questions none of us wanted to answer. Wild animal attack was all Mike would say about his cuts and bruises. The others nodded along. Who would believe the truth anyway? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those creatures watching me with their big, dark eyes. I kept thinking about what the elder had said, about humans destroying their home, about needing a new way. Sarah called the next morning. We need to talk, she said, her voice tight. Can you meet me at the coffee shop in town? When I got there, she was already waiting, her hands wrapped around a mug like she was trying to warm them, even though it was a mild day. I've been thinking, she said as I sat down, about our promise to go back. I nodded. Me too. Those creatures, they've been here all along, Marcus, living under our feet, watching us. She leaned forward. Do you realize what this means for science? For our understanding of everything? I could see the excitement. In her eyes, the scientist in her already thinking about papers and research and fame. They're not lab rats, Sarah, I said quietly. They're intelligent beings protecting their home. She sat back, looking hurt. I know that, but we can't just ignore this discovery. We have to tell someone. Who? The sheriff? The university? The government? I shook my head. You saw what they did to those loggers. What do you think would happen if the military got involved, or some corporation that wanted to study them? Sarah was quiet for a long time. So, what do we do? That was the question, wasn't it? What do we do when we discover we're not alone? For the next 2 days, I thought about nothing else. I walked my forest, looking at it with new eyes, knowing that beneath the trees and rocks was another world, a world we'd been threatening without even knowing it existed. On the 3rd day, I went back to the cave alone. Sarah was angry when I told her I was going without her, but I knew it was the right choice. This wasn't about science or discovery. It was about trust. The elder was waiting for me at the cave entrance, its tall form almost invisible in the shadows. You return, it said. Alone. I nodded. I keep my promises. It led me back down into the underground city, but this time we took a different path. We passed through tunnels I hadn't seen before, some natural, some clearly dug by the creatures over many years. How long have your people been here? I asked. Always, the elder replied. Before humans. We hide, watch, learn. We entered a small chamber where several of the creatures were gathered around what looked like a map. carved into stone. It showed the forest above, with markings I didn't understand. Our territory, the elder explained, shrinking each year, less. I looked at the map, seeing the forest through their eyes, the logging areas, the new hiking trails, the campgrounds, all pushing deeper into what had once been their domain. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. The elder tilted its head. "Sorry, not enough, need help." And then it told me what it wanted, a deal. The creatures would stay hidden, would stop taking humans for their tests. In return, I would help protect certain areas of the forest, their most important territories, places where their tunnels came close to the surface, where they gathered food, where they buried their dead. "Can do this?" the elder asked. I thought about it. As a ranger, I had some influence over forest management, not a lot, but some. I could mark certain areas as protected for endangered species. I could redirect hiking trails. Small things, but maybe enough. "I can try," I said, "but I need something from you too." The elder waited. "No more taking people," I said firmly. "No more tests. If you need to understand us better, talk to me. I'll be your ambassador." For a long moment, the elder was silent. Then it extended one long-fingered hand. "Agreement!" I took its hand. It felt cool and dry with too many joints, but it was a hand reaching out, and that was something. As I climbed back to the surface that evening, I knew my life had changed, forever. I was now the keeper of a secret bigger than just the forest. I was the bridge between two worlds. Would I tell Sarah? Maybe someday. Would I keep my promise to the elder? I had to try. The forest had always been my home, my sanctuary. Now I knew it was home to others too, and somehow we had to find a way to share it. As I walked back to my cabin in the fading light, I felt eyes watching me from the trees. But for the first time, that feeling didn't scare me. "Good night," I whispered to the shadows. "See you tomorrow." And, somewhere in the darkness, I heard a soft click in reply.